The king stands up from his throne and shouts that he's sending the kid to the frontier city of Barbara, making it clear that he needs to leave right now. He tells him to go and whip his lazy, good-for-nothing attitude back into shape while he's out there. The protagonist just stands there taking the hit as the king finishes yelling at him. He doesn't say a word, hair covering his eyes like he's just totally checked out, while his blonde brother watches from the side, looking pretty stressed about the whole thing. The brother tries to speak up, calling out to him and saying that if he's actually going to turn over a new leaf, but the mustache guy nearby cuts him off. He tells the king that he shouldn't be doing this, trying to stop the order from going through. The protagonist's mouth stays shut in a tight line, and he just sighs to himself. He can't believe it's happening, thinking about how his dream of a slow, easy life is totally ruined. Nearby, the advisor's face is tight with tension, clearly not happy with how this is all going down. The king's voice rings out across the entire castle, shouting for everyone to get back. He's had enough, and the protagonist just stands there in the hall with his eyes closed, looking totally exhausted. Rin meets him there and says that he's officially been exiled, so he asks if she heard all that yelling. She just stands there with her arms behind her back, looking a little annoyed while her animal ears twitch. She tells him that with her hearing, it was all loud and clear, and he just says he figured that was the case. He lets out a massive sigh, and Rin starts wondering what she's even supposed to do now that everything is falling apart. The protagonist can't believe his luck, thinking about how this is already going wrong so soon after being reincarnated. He starts thinking back to his past life, and how it all ended back when he was a guy named Kento Sasaki who died at 35. He remembers meeting a goddess with huge wings, and she just looked at him and gave him the bad news that he was officially dead. The goddess looks down at Kento and tells him he actually has a choice to make, but he's just confused and asks what kind of choice she means. She mentions that he saved a young girl right before he died, so Kento remembers the moment clearly. He tells her how he was just walking home from work when he saw a girl falling down the stairs. He jumped in to help, and he figures that's exactly how he ended up dead. The goddess explains that the kid he saved is actually the one destined to save the world in the future. Kento can't believe what he's hearing and asks her to repeat that. It sounds way too intense for a normal Tuesday. She ignores his shock and explains that there's a world out there completely different from the one he's used to, a place where everything is different, and its name is Yggdrasil. She tells him that in order for that girl to eventually save Yggdrasil, she was supposed to be summoned from his world. The goddess looks at him and says she has to do something to prevent that from happening. The goddess explains that an evil god sealed in Yggdrasil was the one who tried to kill the girl, and she lets out a heavy sigh. It's clearly a lot to deal with. She looks him right in the eyes and says that because he saved that girl, she wants to show him some real gratitude. With a small smile, she gives him a choice. He can actually be reincarnated into the world of Yggdrasil. Kento just stands there for a second, taking it all in. He starts thinking back on everything that's happened to him. He realizes his old life was honestly kind of a disaster. It was just miserable from start to finish. The guy was abandoned by his own parents and had to deal with a ton of abuse at a corrupt orphanage. Basically, he never had a chance. He couldn't even make it to high school and ended up stuck as a corporate slave right after finishing middle school, just working his life away. He clenches his fist, wondering if he can finally get what he's always wanted in this new world. All he really wants is a life where he can sleep as much as he needs and just eat his meals in peace, nothing fancy. Just a simple, slow life where he doesn't have to worry about anything anymore. Mars gets all worked up and shouts that this situation is the final result, while Rin just looks at him wondering what's gotten into him so suddenly. He thinks back to the deal he made, remembering how he planned for his old memories to return once he hit 15, but now he has to balance two lives. He realizes his current self is actually Mars, the third prince of the Frisia kingdom, and even though he's the prince, he still has all his memories from growing up in this world. It feels like his old life was just dropped on top of his new one, like it's an extra layer. He looks over at Rin, the girl with the animal ears, and reminds himself that she's his personal maid and bodyguard. Mars starts looking back on everything and admits his exile was actually pretty fair. Rin doesn't even try to sugarcoat it and tells him she agrees, which makes sense since he never bothered to learn swords or magic. He totally skipped out on his studies and didn't even show up to royal balls, because all he did was slack off the entire time he lived in the capital. He just groans thinking about his lazy track record, but he figures the reason he ended up like this is because his original wish was just way too powerful. Remembering his miserable past life as Kento, he stays focused on his goal to just sleep and take it easy this time around. Mars stands there looking pretty serious, thinking about how his only real goal is to just eat and lays around all day, which is exactly why he's in this mess. He starts to realize that he might have overdone it with the slacking lately, and he knows he's just been living off the taxpayers' money this whole time. He admits to himself that it's actually no surprise he got exiled or that everyone in the palace calls him by that one annoying nickname. As he walks past the staff, they all whisper about him being the good-for-nothing youngest son of the family, so he just keeps his head down and ignores them while he makes his way through the halls until Rin spots him and stops in her tracks. She looks pretty worried seeing him like this and just quietly says his name, but suddenly someone else starts screaming for him. This girl looks completely shocked and is yelling for Lord Mars like her life depends on it. She's totally losing it and yells that she doesn't want to hear that this situation can't be helped because to her, the idea of Mars being banished from the kingdom is just the most ridiculous thing she's ever heard. Mars recognizes the girl right away and calls her Lady Silk, while Rin just stands there looking a bit confused by the sudden appearance. Turns out Silk is the daughter of a marquis and is actually Mars' fiancé, which explains why she's taking this so hard. She grips her dress tight and says she heard the news from her father, even about their engagement being cancelled. She's not having it though and tells Mars they need to go talk to the King Mantaman. She insists the king is actually a nice guy and is totally sure he'll forgive everything if they just ask him properly. She's getting worked up now, yelling that she will absolutely never let this happen and tells Mars he just has to accept her help. Mars is pretty much speechless watching her go off like this, but seeing her get so emotional makes him realize something important. He finally understands that even though all his memories from his past life as Kento have come back, he's not that same guy anymore because at the end of the day, his heart and his feelings are still those of a 15-year-old kid. Mars looks at her and thinks about how even though she looks so cute, she's actually got a surprisingly strong-willed side to her, and those eyes of hers show just how determined she really is right now. The truth is, Mars realizes that he actually really likes her, but even though he has feelings for her, he knows what he has to do. He starts to speak up, telling her that's exactly why he can't go along with her plan. He looks her right in the face and says that since it's her, he's sure there is someone way better out there for her to be with. Silk just stands there completely stunned, barely able to make a sound as Mars smiles and says he has no intention of asking anyone to cancel his exile. Mars tells her he's the one who brought all this on himself, so he's got to take full responsibility, explaining that since he's the one being exiled, he can't go back on it. He looks at her and says he can't tie her down or hold her back from her own life. Silk just stands there for a second, quietly saying she sees what he means. She nods and says she understands, but then she starts to speak up again. She takes a step forward, telling him she can't even imagine being with anyone else. She tells him straight up that she doesn't believe this is really goodbye. Silk starts begging him, and while Rin watches from the side, Silk says even if he's going somewhere far away, she just wants one thing. She cries and asks Mars to please never change who he is. Mars just stares at her, looking totally shocked by what she just said. Mars lets out a small smile and admits that what she said really hits a sore spot. He pauses for a second, then nods and says yeah, she's right about everything. He takes her hands in his, looking her right in the eyes and gives her his word. Silk just stares back at him, her eyes are swimming with tears after hearing him say that. Mars looks completely calm and determined, making sure she knows he means it. After a long moment, he finally lets go of her hands, and Silk just stands there. Suddenly she can't hold it back anymore, so she turns around and takes off crying. Mars doesn't move, he just stays there watching her run as far away as she can. Lin walks up behind him looking pretty stressed and quietly says his name. He acknowledges her, but keeps staring down the hall telling her this whole thing is just awful. Mars realizes that his plan to slack off is actually more important now than ever. Lin looks at him like he's lost it, completely confused by where his head is at. He explains that he needs to make sure he stays the same guy he's always been, getting all worked up while shouting about how he has to keep being a lazy bum even in exile. Lin just stands in the back and sighs totally over his drama. She tells him that a reformed version of him would actually be pretty creepy, and Mars just smiles, noting how she never holds back. He starts walking down the hall with his hands behind his head, mentioning that he's officially taking off, but he stops for a second and calls back to her. Lin looks at him with total serious vibes and tells him she's going to follow him anywhere since he saved her life. He goes quiet for a moment and just says he gets it. With everything settled, he tells her it's time to go as they finally start their journey. Lin looks at Mars and asks if he's really sure about leaving his stuff behind, but Mars just shrugs it off, saying he's decided to earn his own living from here on out. Lin sounds pretty concerned, asking if he hit his head, but Mars explains she's almost right. He's just doing this so he can actually chill out and be lazy in the future. He stands there with his hands behind his head, casually mentioning he's just aiming for that slow life, which reminds him of the time the goddess told him she was giving him a massive talent for magic. She told him that just sending him to another world wasn't a good enough reward on its own, so she made sure he would have way more magical power than any ordinary human, giving him the ability to use every element from fire and water to wind and earth. The goddess even mentioned that if he actually tried, he could easily wipe out an entire country, and Mars realizes that this whole setup is exactly what everyone calls a cheat power. The goddess finishes up her explanation, telling Mars that killing people is off-limits unless it's for self-defense, but she makes it clear that monsters are fair game since they're just minions for the evil god. With everything settled, she says her goodbyes and wishes him a great life in this new world. Mars stares blankly for a second as the memory of the goddess fades away, and then Lin calls his name from behind him on the horse, snapping him back to the present. He asks what's up, so she asks if he's really sure about skipping the royal escort, especially since the king probably had guys ready. Mars admits she has a point, but mentions the ride to Barbara is going to take at least 4 days. He tells her not to worry since there aren't any scary monsters on this path, though Lin still seems a bit uneasy, but Mars is secretly determined to handle things himself because he just doesn't want her to suffer anymore. It's a tough situation because in this world, beastmen like Lin are basically stuck in the slave class. Lin wasn't any different from the other beastmen back then. Some guy just stands there holding a whip and yells that she better be grateful she's even getting hired. He keeps laying into her, yelling about how she failed to become human and calling her a total reject while she just sits there crying and taking the hits. The guy is about to swing again when Mars suddenly shows up and calls out to him, stopping him in his tracks. Mars looks at the young girl and then calmly asks the man if he can just buy her right then and there. Young Lin just stares back at him with tears running down her face, looking completely stunned. Thinking about it now, Mars figures his soul was probably just projecting his old life as a corporate slave onto her, which is why Lin looks at him with a smile and thanks him for everything he's done since that day. She puts a hand to her chest and promises that from now on, she's going to be the one to protect him. But Mars just smiles and reminds her that he's a D-rank adventurer now, so he can definitely hold his own. Lin laughs a bit and says he really has gotten strong, especially considering how skinny he was when they first met. Lin listens as Mars looks over and tells her that he's only where he is because she helped him out, but Lin just looks down, saying that for a beastman like her, he was the one who actually saved her life. She explains that she's been working so hard to repay that debt of gratitude, and since she never got a real education, focusing on getting stronger was the only path she could take. The two of them walk through the quiet fields as she tells him he really doesn't have to worry about her anymore. As they ride their horse down the trail, she points out how much he's done and that she won't even be able to pay him back. But Mars says that's not a problem. Lin looks at him with a soft expression and says that wherever he goes, that's the only place where she truly belongs, which makes Mars blush as he stares ahead. He takes a second to process it and says he gets it, then looks back and thanks Rin. Mars gives her a big smile and says he's counting on her from here on out. Lin tells Mars to just leave everything to her, promising to keep a close eye on things while Lady Silk isn't around. Mars seems a bit confused by the sudden intensity, but she tells him not to think too much about it and just keep moving down the trail. But then Lin's animal ears twitch as she picks up a weird noise coming from nearby. She spots something moving in the bushes and thinks it's a goblin, suggesting they should probably run for it, but Mars tells her to hold on. He gets a serious look on his face and says he's going to take care of this himself. Lin gives him a look like she can't believe him, and asks if he's heard a single word she said, reminding him that he hasn't even been practicing his sword skills or his magic lately. Mars just puts his hand up to stop her, saying there's no time for jokes right now because suddenly a pair of goblins jump out of the forest, screaming as they close in on them. The creatures look absolutely feral, showing off their sharp teeth as they prepare to attack. Mars clenches his fist with a confident look and tells Lin to just watch him. He figures it's time to test out this magic cheat he's been given, so he steps up and focuses everything into his next move, his eyes locking onto the target. Lin can't even process what he's doing and just looks on, totally confused. A goblin lunges from the trees, but Mars is faster, calling out a wind cutter spell that blows the creature away in a massive explosion, leaving nothing but smoke. The two of them just stand there with their mouths hanging open, completely stunned, until Lin finally finds her voice. Mars starts laughing nervously, saying he just got caught up in the moment. She starts listing off all the crazy stuff he just did, like casting multiple types of magic at once. But Mars just smiles, realizing that even for a first try, this cheat power feels way too natural. Lin trails off while looking at Mars, and he just stares back wondering what's up. Suddenly she starts yelling, demanding to know why he's been hiding such massive power this whole time. She rants about how magic that strong requires insane talent and mastery, making Mars pretty uncomfortable, so he tries to play it cool, explaining that he honestly just didn't realize he could actually use it yet. Lin's eyes go wide as a crazy theory starts forming in her head, and she realizes that if anyone had known about his power sooner, it probably would have completely changed who got the throne. She asks if he gave up being king on purpose for his older brother, but Mars tells her no immediately. Lin puts her hands together and tells him to stop, acting like she knows the truth now, deciding he's just a legendary humble person for stepping aside, while Mars completely panics over the misunderstanding. She mentions that Silk probably noticed his greatness too, leaving Mars to just nervously ask if she really thinks so. Lin keeps gushing over him, calling his power a total cheat, which makes Mars sweat as he tells her to stop looking at him like that. She just brushes it off and says she's going to go ahead and start gathering up the magic stones from the ground. While she's busy, Mars stands by the horse thinking about the monsters, realizing he just killed them and doesn't even feel bad about it. He watches her work and starts thinking that maybe he really has become a person of this world after all. And honestly, he figures that probably makes it a lot easier for him to survive and live his life here. Suddenly Lin yells his name, pointing out that a creature called a bulls has just shown up, so Mars wonders if it's another monster at first. But then he sees it and realizes it's actually a magical beast. He remembers that while normal monsters are just enemies that drop stones when they're beaten, magical beasts are a bit different since they aren't exactly enemies, but they're still really dangerous to have around. Looking at the beast, he knows it's basically an adventurer's duty to take out these bulls as soon as they're spotted. The bull's beast stares them down, but Mars is just thinking about how good its meat tastes and how much people love eating it basically. He stops seeing it as a threat and starts seeing it as a meal. The creature lets out a massive roar, getting ready to stampede, but Mars is already shouting about how it's time to go get some ingredients. He tells Lin that today's dinner is standing right in front of them, and she tells him to back off because she's taking this one. Mars is totally down for that and tells her he can't wait to see her show off. The beast charges straight at them with everything it's got, but Lin doesn't even flinch. She moves in a blur as the monster reaches her, and she cuts through it in one shot, casually putting her sword away while the beast gets sliced clean in half. Mars can't believe how fast she was and yells about how cool she looks. Lin gets all flustered after the praise, acting shy and asking if he really thinks so before giving a quiet thanks. Mars just nods and looks over the beast, impressed by how clean the cut was, but then he asks what they should do next. Lin reminds him that they definitely can't haul a giant carcass around everywhere. Mars just laughs it off and says that's pretty obvious. Standing by their horse in the middle of the woods, Mars shouts out that it's finally time to get cooking. He looks right at Lin and tells her he wants to roast the entire animal whole. Lin is completely stunned and asks him to repeat himself because that sounds crazy. She tries to be reasonable, saying it's fine but it would take way too long to cook through, and besides he'll get sick if it's raw. She asks how he even expects to pull off a roast that big anyway. Mars just gives her a confident look and says everything is fine. He tells her to just sit back and leave it all to him. Mars throws his hands out and calls for a stone wall instantly. Massive slabs of rock burst out of the soil, surrounding them with a heavy thud as Lin just stands there with her mouth open, totally stunned by the scale of the magic he's using. Mars isn't finished yet, shouting for a stone needle next as he slams his hand down. Spikes start shooting out to set everything up just right. Lin watches him go and just shakes her head, muttering about what a total waste of magic this whole setup is. Mars catches his breath and explains he's always wanted to try this, plus he still needs to reinforce the structure to make sure it holds. He tries to move the massive carcass and realizes the weight is no joke. Lin just stares at him, annoyed since she already did the work of gutting it. Seeing him struggle, she sighs and says she'll just do it herself. Mars looks pretty embarrassed and gives her a quick apology for the trouble. But then she gives him a small smile and tells him it's fine. She says they should just do whatever he wants to do. Mars gets all excited and thanks her. He even calls her Rin in the heat of the moment, making her stop and just blink at him, looking a little surprised by his sudden burst of energy. Mars watches Lin work and mentions how a beastman's strength really is something else, while he tells himself that his own cheat powers are basically just magic compared to her raw power. He finally finishes setting up the cooking spit and yells out that he's done, looking pretty proud of the whole thing as he holds up his hands and calls out for fire to get things moving. A small flame pops up right under the pile of wood, starting the campfire to cook the meat. Mars stands back and admires the fire, and even Lin has to admit that the setup actually looks pretty decent. Mars gets this smug look on his face and asks her if she really gets the significance of what he's making, proudly declaring that this right here is official Isekai food. Lin just stares at him totally lost and asks what he's even talking about, making him realize how dumb he sounds, so he just tells her to forget it. She points out that the meat is probably gonna cook pretty unevenly that way, and Mars just sighs and tells her he already knows. Mars gets ready and tells Lin he's going to show her how it's done, holding his hands out as he shouts for an extra stone wall to just appear out of nowhere. He builds a stone box around the food but leaves the top open a tiny bit, explaining that this should steam roast the meat perfectly, and now they just have to sit back and wait. Lin looks at the improvised oven and asks Mars if his mana is actually doing okay since he's using so much of it, but Mars just looks back and tells her he's completely fine. She says it's just like him to have enough mana to waste on cooking, though he yells right back that it's not a waste at all, eventually telling her it's time to release the spell. The stone disappears and the meat looks incredible, leaving Lin shocked while Mars says it looks delicious. The two of them just stand there staring at the food, basically drooling over the smell. Mars calls out to Lin to get her attention. She snaps out of her daze and blushes. He says there's no point waiting around and they should just eat, making her tail wag in total excitement. Mars takes a massive bite of the meat and shouts for them to dig in. The savory flavor and the sweet fat of the meat just explode in his mouth, leading him to yell about how great it is. Lin tries to lecture him on manners with her mouth full, but Mars isn't buying it. He just laughs and thinks about how the food in this world is the best. After finishing, he leans back and says he's totally satisfied because that meal was incredible. Lin looks at the giant roast they barely finished and points out they have a ton of leftovers. Mars asks if the nearby village is about an hour's walk away. Lin tells him he's right. Since they can't finish it all, Mars decides he'll just give the extra food to the villagers. Lin looks at Mars and asks if he's really sure about this, reminding him that the guild would pay good money for all that meat. But Mars just smiles and tells her it's fine because it's not that much to give away. He mentions that everyone is dealing with food shortages these days, so he wants to help out. Lin agrees with him and says she feels lucky to be where she is right now, thinking about how Mars was the one who actually saved her and her people from starving to death. She looks a bit down and says the rest of the beastmen aren't doing as well, since they're still stuck in poverty, noting that since humans are also having a hard time, the gap between everyone is just getting wider. Mars listens and says he really thinks things would turn around if there was just more food available. Lin nods and says the beastmen definitely get where he's coming from, but she adds that because humans are struggling so much, they end up taking it out on her kind and forcing more pressure onto them. Mars listens closely as the mood gets heavy, his eyes staying fixed on her while he thinks about how the beastmen are physically amazing, but they still have a massive weakness since none of them have any real magic power to speak of. It turns out that because of that one flaw, they've all been forced into magic collars and treated like literal slaves by humans for a long time. Mars hears this, and his face gets serious, saying out loud that the way they're treated is totally unforgivable. Lin looks back at him in total shock when he suddenly says her name, but then Mars points out the obvious fact that she isn't actually wearing one of those collars herself. He looks her right in the eye and tells her she's free to just run away whenever she wants, leaving Lin standing there completely frozen as she tries to wrap her head around what he just said. Lin warns Mars that he's definitely going to make people angry acting like that, so he just nervously apologizes for bringing it up. They both stand there in a heavy silence for a second, just looking at each other while Lin repeats the word slaves to herself, clearly thinking about everything her people have been through. Mars watches her and thinks about how he really just wishes everyone could live a simple life and take it easy. Later, at a nearby village, Mars sits behind a massive pile of food and tells the locals to share it all, and the villagers completely lose it, crying and thanking him for being so generous with such a huge catch. One guy shouts for everyone to come eat while another yells out a huge thanks to Mars for the meal. Someone in the crowd gets hyped up and demands to know whoever called Mars a freeloader, but he just laughs it off and says it's fine, even though he admits he can't really deny being a bit of a loafer. The two of them end up staying the night there, with Lin even helping out in the kitchen. Mars and Lin decide to skip the long goodbyes because they're such a hassle, so they just head out, leaving extra early in the morning to start their journey. After spending another 4 days traveling down the road, they finally make it to the city of Barbara. Mars looks at the place he's been exiled to, realizing that this is his new home. Just then, a guard comes running up and apologizes for keeping them waiting, while Mars just gives him a friendly smile and tells him it's really not a big deal. The guy seems a bit taken back and asks if he's actually Lord Marth, saying he's heard plenty of stories about him before. He introduces himself as Yoru, the captain of the guard, and offers to show them around if they follow him. Mars tells him that sounds good and asks him to lead the way, but Yoru just stands there looking confused, thinking to himself that Mars is way nicer than the rumors suggested. Mars can't help but laugh, realizing that the group is finally walking through the busy streets of his new home. Mars looks around at the streets while they walk and notes that the city is a lot different from the royal capital. He follows up by asking if it's true that people usually call this place the abandoned city, but an older man passing by speaks up, explaining that the city used to be a huge trade hub for the southern country. But since those ties were cut, the whole place just feels lifeless and empty. Yoru apologizes for the state of things, mentioning it's a pretty poor land, but Mars tells him not to worry since he feels like he should be the one apologizing instead. Yoru goes quiet for a second before changing the subject, starting to ask a question, wondering why Mars decided to bring a slave along with him, making Lin's eyes go wide as she freezes up, looking totally shaken by the question. Yoru looks at her and notes that she's definitely a beastman, right? He points out that she isn't wearing a collar, which seems to be a pretty big deal to the locals. Lin is clearly panicking and starts to sweat. She stammers out a question, asking Mars if he's really sure about this. Yoru doesn't make it any easier and points out that she's free to just run away whenever she wants, which just makes Lin freeze up even more. She tries to get some words out to answer him, but she can barely speak. Mars steps in right then with a serious look and shuts it down. He tells Yoru straight up that Lin isn't a slave at all. He keeps going, explaining that she's actually his personal bodyguard and his maid. The news has Lin looking completely shocked. Yoru is caught totally off guard by the prince's casual attitude and starts fumbling over his words trying to reply. So Mars just gives a little smile and apologizes for the confusion. He jokes that he's probably just a bit of an oddball compared to most royals. He follows that up by telling the captain that, for now, he just wants everyone to treat him like an equal, leaving Yoru with no choice but to agree. He looks a bit awkward about it but tells the prince he understands the request. Even though he acted cool, Mars looks away and realizes he might have just said something pretty embarrassing. Mars remembers how Lin has made her feelings clear to him plenty of times before, and she's always told him that she's going to follow him wherever he goes, not because she's a slave, but because he saved her life. She truly feels like she belongs by his side, and Mars knows she's only here because she chose this of her own free will. He figures that treating her like she's fragile would actually be worse for her in the long run, especially since she just looks at him with a smile and says having him there is all that really matters. The group finally pulls up to a massive, fancy-looking manor with huge white pillars. Mars takes a look at the place and realizes this is supposed to be the Lord's mansion, but he's still a bit confused about how things work here, so he asks Yoru where the actual Lord is staying. Yoru just stands there for a second looking completely baffled by the whole question. He has to break the news to Mars and explains that, as far as he was told, Mars is the one in charge of the whole place now. Mars and Lin just stand there staring at each other in total silence. Neither of them saw this coming, and Mars is completely caught off guard by the news, realizing that he's somehow ended up as the official lord of this whole town. Back at Frisia Castle, things are getting loud as two people start shouting for their brother. Someone is clearly furious, and it turns out to be Mars's older brother Lil, a knight who's losing his mind over Mars being sent off to Barbara. Right behind him is Lyra, their sister and a court mage, who's screaming at the top of her lungs to have her sweet little brother brought back. The eldest brother sits at his desk looking totally drained, telling both of them to just pipe down for a second so they can actually talk. But Lil isn't having it and keeps going on about how Mars is stuck in some remote backwater like a victim. The eldest brother admits he didn't want this either, especially since Mars is the baby of the family their parents left behind, making Lyra demand to know why he went through with it then. He just looks down, explaining that the truth is they all spoiled the kid way too much. Lil tries to say something but stops, while the eldest brother admits that even though it was necessary, it still feels just as bad for him to let Mars go. Looking back, Mars lost his parents when he was only 3, he barely even remembers them, so the older siblings stepped up and raised him with so much love, it was like they were his actual parents. But the eldest brother points out that they went overboard, they spoiled him so much that people started calling him a total loser. Lil quickly jumps in to defend him, mentioning that the kid is actually really smart and way more popular than people think. Lyra agrees, shouting about how kind he is. Their big brother just nods, saying he already knows all that, but he reminds them that Mars is a grown man now, and if they keep babying him like this, it's eventually going to ruin his future and hold him back from becoming who he needs to be. Lyra and Lil look down, finally admitting that their brother is probably right about the whole situation. The eldest brother apologizes for making the call to send him away without talking to them first, but then he looks at them and says he isn't actually that worried about how Mars will handle himself out there. The eldest brother thinks back to the last time he saw Mars. The look in the kid's eyes stayed with him because there was something different about it, making him wonder if Mars might actually pull off something big. Cut to the frontier, where Mars is already slumped over his food. He's exhausted and just wants to go back to the castle. Lin looks at him from across the table, reminding him that he's literally only just finished looking around the town, but Mars just keeps eating, complaining that the pressure of being a lord is already way too much for him. He shifts the topic to the local situation. He's heard there's a major food shortage going on, mostly with the meat supply. Mars looks at his own plate and notices there's barely any meat in this meal either, even if it does taste all right. Lin asks if what they're currently eating is meat from a horned rabbit, and Mars explains that the people here only raise those because they're weak and easy to handle, but they barely provide any actual food. Mars realizes that if they're going to fix this, they need to track down some much bigger magical beasts for the town. Lin points out that the whole food situation is going to be a real pain to deal with, and Mars just sighs, admitting he's gotta find a way to fix that on top of everything else. The group keeps moving through the town, passing by locals while Mars tries to get a better feel for the place he's supposed to be running. Yoru speaks up to grab their attention as Lin mentions they've finally made it to the very last stop on their tour of the city, which leads them to a massive stone wall. Yoru points out that this is actually the only spot in the entire area that has any real defenses or a gate. He explains that the reason for all the extra security is because this is the Beastmen's residential district. Mars just nods along, taking it all in. The three of them stand there watching as the huge wooden gates start to pull back, revealing what's hidden on the other side. The view inside is pretty grim. There are beastmen everywhere just slumped against the walls, looking totally exhausted and hungry. Yoru starts to stammer, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, while Mars just stares in shock. Lin narrows her eyes, mentioning that the whole vibe here feels totally off and more kids are seen huddled together in the dirt, looking like they've completely given up hope. Mars and Lin walk deeper into the district, passing by more people who can barely even look up as the new lord of the land passes by. Lin looks at the beastmen kids sitting in the dirt. They look totally drained and she's visibly shaken by it. Yoru starts sweating, stammering that they would never treat people like this on purpose, but Mars just looks away, saying it's not like they're trying to be monsters. The reality is right in front of them though, and Mars points out how everyone's eyes just look completely dead inside. Yoru can't even find the words to respond as Lin stands her ground, telling Mars she isn't asking for total freedom right now. She just wants their living conditions to stop being so miserable. Yoru gets even more nervous, worried about what happens if they break tradition, but Mars starts thinking about what changing their old ways would actually look like. He looks over and tells Yoru that he honestly understands why the guy is so worried about the fallout. But he isn't backing down, firmly stating that the beastmen aren't any different from the rest of them. He goes on to say that these people just want the simple stuff, like eating a decent meal and having a warm bed to sleep in. Yoru's eyes go wide as Mars adds that they just want to spend time with their families. It's a total reality check that leaves the guard captain clenching his fist, admitting that while Mars is totally right, actually making those changes happen is going to be a massive challenge. Yoru admits they're so low on supplies they don't even have enough for the humans, and Lin is just slumped on the ground, totally drained. Mars just stares off into the distance, quietly agreeing that he knows how bad things have gotten, so he decides they should just head back for now and come up with a real plan. They make their way back to the manor, where the sun is still high over the stone pillars. Once they're settled inside, Mars looks over some notes and tells Yoru and Lin he finally understands what the town is dealing with. He breaks it down like a simple math problem. No food means no energy, which means nobody can actually fight back against the monsters, and he thinks that's the core issue. The bottom line is that as long as they're starving, the monsters are always going to have the upper hand, which makes Lin smile as she points out that finding a way to get food is definitely their best bet. Mars nods and says they'll start there, figuring the rest of the complicated stuff can wait until people aren't hungry. Yoru asks what he wants to do first, and Mars just pushes back his chair, saying he's going to head out and get started. Mars lets Yoru know he's planning to head out and check the northern forest for a bit, but Yoru immediately loses it, reminding him that monsters are all over that place and asking if he realizes how dangerous it is. Mars just plays it cool, telling the captain it's no big deal since Lin is an amazing bodyguard, and he makes sure to mention that he can handle himself with magic too. Yoru doesn't really have a comeback for that, so he just tells them to stay safe as Mars waves goodbye, leaving the captain standing there alone, wondering if he's even useful or just a guy living off the prince's dime. Once they're in the woods, Mars and Lin jump into action, taking down any monsters that get in their way. After a while, Lin notes they've managed to find plenty of fruit and herbs, which Mars is pretty happy about, but just as he's talking about what they need next, Lin's ears twitch and she completely locks in on a sound. Mars is about to ask what's up, but she leans in close and tells him to keep it down. Lin stays low behind a tree and whispers for Mars to follow her this way. She's found something big, and right there in the clearing stands a massive unicorn-looking monster with another one grazing nearby. The ground literally shakes under the weight of the beast as it stands guard. It's way bigger than anything they've seen yet. Mars gets pretty hyped and identifies it as an Orobin, thinking about how huge it would be if they could actually bring it back. But Lin keeps her cool and points out that they're a mated pair. She asks him if he can use his magic to handle things. Mars says he could probably take one down, but he's worried his magic might just vaporize the thing completely, so he asks if just getting one is okay. Lin tells him she can manage that. Mars starts to draw his sword and says he'll go after the male one in the front. He's ready to jump in, but Lin stops him and asks him to take the female in the back instead. She explains that if they only kill one, the other will totally freak out and go into a frenzy, so they have to drop them both at the same time. Mars grips his sword tight. He feels bad about it, but they need to eat to survive, so he makes up his mind. He tells himself it's time to move and gets ready to jump out from the brush. Mars charges out into the clearing at full speed. His sword is drawn and he's heading straight for the monsters. The big male Oroban in the front hears him coming and turns its head just in time to see him. The beast looks completely wild. It starts drooling and lets out a nasty growl as it prepares to fight back. Mars sees the monster's reaction and locks in, focusing everything on the strike. Suddenly, Lin moves in way faster than expected. She catches the monster's attention with a heavy hit to its side. She doesn't slow down for a second, following up with a quick horizontal slash that keeps the beast off balance. Lin manages to draw the first one away. Mars watches for a split second before realizing he has a clear shot at the other one. He throws his hands out and lets a wind slash fly. It tears right through the air and hits the second Oroban clean. The monster lets out a deafening roar, showing off those nasty sharp teeth, but it doesn't scare Lin at all, and she holds her ground as the beast recoils for a second. It tries to get its bearings, though Lin isn't giving it any room to breathe. She yells at it not to mess with her while she starts a massive swing, and with one quick, heavy horizontal slash, she cuts right through. The blade is moving so fast that the monster's head gets completely taken off, flying through the air as its body goes limp. Mars just stands there watching as the huge beast collapses into the grass. Lin is totally calm, acting like it was nothing special. She takes a breath and tells Mars she's sorry she couldn't finish it with just one strike, but Mars smiles and says he's the one who should be apologizing. He admits he actually got a little overwhelmed back there, so Lin says they're even now. She suggests they both just keep practicing to get stronger, and they share a high five, with Mars agreeing that she's totally right. They both look pretty happy with the progress they're making. Mars stares ahead with a look of serious focus, telling himself that even though it's tough, looking at the monster makes him realize something important. If he actually wants to eat meat, he has to face the reality of what that looks like. Standing before the dead beast, he finally gets what it really means to be a hunter and closes his eyes to pull himself together. He mentions that back in his old life, he always had other people handle the messy prep work, but this time he's determined to do it all himself. Lin is pretty confused and asks what caused the sudden change of heart. So Mars just tells her to leave it to him and gives a quick thanks for the meal before getting started. The reality hits him fast though. He's holding his mouth and looking totally sick, mentally apologizing to every hunter out there for ever thinking this was easy. Lin is losing it over the mess and yells for him to wash off the blood, while Mars tries to change the subject, wondering how they're even going to move these massive bodies back home. Mars realizes he messed up and didn't think about how they'd move the heavy monster. He tells Lin he's sorry for the oversight, especially since he asks if she can carry them both herself. Lin says she could probably do it, but she doesn't seem very happy about the extra work, so she mentions they really should have brought a cart from the start. Mars starts thinking of other ways home, wondering if they could just build a sled or if they could somehow just drag the bodies back. Suddenly he gets a bright idea and snaps his fingers, and then Lin asks what he's planning, but he just tells her to give him a second while he puts his hands out to focus. Moving on, a huge sheet of ice covers the ground instantly. Lin can't believe her eyes and stammers that he just used ice magic, leaving her totally freaked out, because that's a high-level spell only elite court mages can use. Mars just looks back at her and asks if it's really that big of a deal, while she explains that the amount of mana and skill needed to turn water into ice is insane. He just made this whole ice road without even breaking a sweat. Mars just gives a little embarrassed smile and brushes it off, saying he only knew how to do it because he saw it in a book once. Lin tells Mars that just because he saw a spell in a book doesn't mean he should be able to just do it, but Mars tells her to never mind the details. Lin looks at the ice and asks how they're actually supposed to move the monsters like this, so Mars says he'll just make a bit more ice. He puts his hands out and focuses his power, and then he explains he's using earth magic to carve a hole right through the center. He grabs some rope and says they can just thread it through the hole to pull it along like a makeshift sled. Lin is just standing there completely floored that he can pull off such a massive ice spell so easily. She asks him if he even has enough mana left to make it back home, especially since monsters are bound to show up, but Mars just gives her a confident look and says he still has plenty of mana to spare. He asks her to start loading the catch onto the ice block, and Lin finally sees where he's going with this. She gets to work moving the massive monster legs onto their new ride. Mars watches her work and mentions that what she does seems way more impressive. He asks her if she's using that power called Battle Aura, and Lin smiles and confirms that since beastmen can't use magic, they rely on battle aura instead. She explains that they use the energy inside their bodies to make themselves way stronger and tougher than normal. But Mars notes that even so, not every beastman is actually capable of tapping into that power. He pulls the rope tight while Lin mentions her specific race has a version of that power that's even more intense. Mars says it's time to start moving, so the two of them begin pulling the massive monster along. Lin admits she didn't even know her race was special until much later, and Mars just tells her he gets it. He asks if she belongs to the Flame Fox tribe, an ancient group known for having hair like fire, and he realizes she's probably a pureblood based on her features. As they walk, Lin tells him that back when she was a slave, most people just thought she was from the dog tribe, mostly because her hair was pitch black back then, making her true identity a total mystery to everyone. Lin continues her story, mentioning that once she arrived here and finally took a bath, her hair changed from that dull black into a really beautiful crimson color, and Mars starts thinking back to their childhood, realizing how crazy it was that he used to bathe and sleep right next to someone so beautiful. He tries to justify it to himself, noting he was only 10 and she was 15 back then, so a small, mischievous smile starts to form on Lin's face as she notices him overthinking. She looks him right in the eyes and asks if he wants to take a bath together again once they get back, or if he'd actually prefer it if they just slept together instead. Mars completely freezes up, his eyes going wide as he tries to process what she just said. He looks like he's about to lose it from the pressure, but Lin just keeps that playful look on her face. She laughs it off and says she's only joking, especially since Silk would probably kill them both if they actually did that. Mars quickly agrees with Lin to hide his nerves, but he can't help wondering how Silk would react to all this. While the sun starts to set over the quiet roofs of the frontier town, they head back to the city where Lin waits by the supply carriage, leaving Mars standing alone to take a huge breath, psyching himself up for what he has to do next. He starts shouting at the top of his lungs, calling for everyone's attention and making sure the beastmen hear him too, so he can announce an official message from the Lord, which has the local families wondering what's actually happening. Mars tells the crowd they're setting up a soup kitchen and asks anyone with small children to bring their bowls over. Plus, he makes sure to mention that anyone who is sick or can't move should be looked after as well. He explains that those groups get priority since they don't have much food yet, and a few beastmen kids start peeking out of their homes. Mars finishes by promising he'll get more supplies soon, asking the rest of the town to just be patient for a bit. A beastman girl asks nervously if it's really okay for their kind to join in, and Mars tells her it's totally fine. But some of the guys in the back start shouting, calling Mars a liar and asking what kind of shady stuff he's planning to make them do. Mars stays calm and tells the beastmen that as soon as they're healthy again, he wants them to go out hunting, though they immediately freak out, thinking he just wants to use them as bait for monsters and warning everyone not to get fooled. Suddenly, a loud voice cuts through the noise telling everyone to shut up. The whole crowd goes dead silent as Lin steps forward, telling them she's a proud member of the Flame Fox tribe and that Mars saved her life when she was starving. She bows low to her people, begging them to just trust her this one time, which leaves the crowd whispering and unsure, especially since she looks so healthy while the kids are crying about being hungry. Mars shows off the massive animal they caught, and Lin tells everyone that she and the prince hunted this together, so he tells them there's no need to pay for the food. It's just a greeting from him as their new lord. The big announcement goes out that food distribution is starting in an hour, and the guards explain that soldiers and adventurers will be helping everyone out, so they should all come back soon. Mars just stands there watching the crowd, wearing a tiny, satisfied smile as the beastmen absolutely lose it. One guy runs off to find his mom while others try to keep the group from panicking. Watching them head off, Mars figures things turned out pretty good for the time being, and he turns to Lin to thank her, telling her he's really glad she was there, which makes her blush and act all shy. Mars calls out to Yoru, casually telling the big guy that he's leaving all the commanding to him now, but Yoru just stands there with a dark look on his face, looking like he's about to break. Suddenly, Yoru slams his head into the ground in a massive bow, screaming an apology that catches Mars completely off guard. He keeps going, saying he's sorry for calling them freeloaders and being such a jerk to them before. Yoru is still freaking out and apologizing, saying he has no words for how he acted, especially toward Lin. She's caught totally off guard by the sudden bowing and tells him it's really not a big deal, but Yoru just thumps his chest with a huge grin, shouting for them to leave all the commanding and heavy lifting to him. He looks genuinely hyped, mentioning how it's been forever since he's had a job this exciting, and Mars agrees that it's a good plan. So Lin suggests that the two of them should probably get started on their own tasks. Mars crouches down and uses his magic to grow stone pillars right out of the dirt to act as a stove, and pretty soon they've got a massive fire going under the pots to get the water boiling. Lin walks over with her knife and reports that she's finished butchering the Orabin, and Mars thanks her before he starts planning the whole menu, deciding to use the bones for broth and the thighs for a big stew. He keeps going, saying the loin and ribs will be roasted while the shanks get added to the pot, and even mentions he'll deep fry the tenderloin later while mincing the tough neck meat. He's got the whole thing figured out. Lin just stands there completely stunned by his expert knowledge, finally asking him how he even knows this much about cooking. Mars plays it cool and tells Lin he just read all that stuff in a book, but she just sighs like she isn't buying it for a second, which makes Mars think back to his old life. Before he reincarnated, he was just a single orphan living on his own, so he ended up cooking for himself all the time. Back in the present, he keeps the grill going, and the local kids start noticing the smell. One girl points out how good it looks, while her friend asks if they can actually have some. Mars spots them and calls the little kids over, telling them that the food is going to be ready in just a second. He finishes grilling the meat and asks if the portions look all right, making sure everyone gets a good amount before he kneels down to hand a full plate to a quiet beastman child standing nearby. The kid just stares at the food for a moment, looking totally surprised and asking if it's really for them. Mars gives a warm smile and tells them to take their time eating, which gets a big thank you from the happy kid as they dig in immediately. The food is hot and delicious. The little girl takes a bite and her eyes light up. She says it's so delicious while Mars stands there with a big smile, just happy to see everyone enjoying the food. Lin and the kids are totally relieved, thanking him over and over for the meal as Mars tells them not to fill up yet because the hot pot is going to be ready in just a second. He pulls the lid off and says it's finally finished, a nice rustic venison stew packed with veggies. Mars cups his hands and yells out to the whole camp, letting everyone know the food is ready. The kids start calling for their parents and people follow the smell, saying it's the best thing they've smelled in forever. The crowd rushes in so fast that Mars starts panicking a little. He has to shout for everyone to please get in a line. One of the Beastmen adventurers tells his crew to stay sharp and keep their guard up. They're being paid good money for this. The rest of the guys cheer and tell him they've got it handled, leaving Mars to focus on serving everyone. Mars starts handing out the food, telling the first girl in line, "Here you go," as Lin steps up and asks if she can help him serve the rest. Mars is happy for the help, telling her yes please, so she takes over the bowls while Mars stays by the pot, the two of them working together to feed everyone. A little girl takes her first bite and her eyes go wide, saying it's delicious, while one of the Beastman kids says the food feels so warm. The older woman with her just nods and says she's right. The massive pot is scraped clean, not a single drop of the venison stew left. A couple of kids come up to thank the mister for the meal, telling him how much they loved it as their mom freaks out a bit, reminding them he's the Lord. Mars just laughs it off and tells them not to worry. He gets down on one knee to ask the kids if they're full, and they all yell out a big yes together. As they walk away waving, Mars just stands there, feeling a little overwhelmed by how thankful everyone is. The Beastman kids finish their meal. One of them says it was delicious while the other thanks Mars for everything. Mars tells them he'll be making more and they should come back to eat, but the kids get nervous, saying they don't have any money, as Mars tells them not to worry and to just look at it as an upfront investment, leaving the little girl a bit confused. He thinks for a second and then says he'd appreciate it if they worked for him once they're healthy. The boy gets pumped and promises to do his best. The other kids all jump in right away, shouting that they want to help out too. Mars just smiles and tells them that if they want to work later, they're going to have to eat a ton until then. All the kids yell out a loud yes with huge smiles on their faces. Once the kids leave, Mars finally lets out a deep breath, but Rin tells him his first impression as the Lord was totally perfect. Mars tells Rin she did a great job today. She just smiles back and says she's gotta score some points first. She leans in with a playful look, noticing his face and asking if he's actually blushing. Lin keeps teasing him, asking if he's actually blushing. Mars just looks away and says he's not used to all this attention. He realizes that being thanked by everyone honestly feels pretty good. The people tell him they've always been grateful for everything he's done, and he just gives a quiet thanks back while looking out at the crowd. It brings back memories of when Lin was a slave getting yelled at by some guy for just looking around. The guy kept hitting her, saying she's lucky he's even hiring a worthless piece of trash like her, while she just stood there crying and apologizing. She was completely losing it, wondering why any of this had to happen to her. She just kept praying for anyone to come and save her. The poor girl just wanted to know why she was being treated so badly. Suddenly, Mars shows up with Lyra and his guards looking totally serious. Lin can't believe her eyes seeing Mars and even Lyra standing right there in front of her. Lyra explains to Mars that the girl is just a slave, which makes Mars think for a second before asking the merchant if it's even legal to go around hitting slaves. Lyra gives the guy a terrifying look and tells him that kind of thing isn't allowed, making the merchant completely freak out and start shaking. Mars looks down at Lin, who's just standing there with tears in her eyes looking up at him like he's her only hope. Looking totally serious, Mars tells his sister they need to call off the rest of their shopping trip for the day. Then he turns and asks if he can just buy the girl right then and there. Lin can't believe what she's hearing. Her eyes go wide with total shock as she processes what he just said. Lyra smiles, thinking about how kind her brother is, but she reminds him that saving just one person isn't going to change how the world works. But Mars doesn't care about the big picture and tells her he doesn't mind, before asking the merchant one more time if he can buy her. The merchant jumps at the chance, bowing down and saying he'd be more than happy to make the deal. Since his mind is made up, Lyra agrees and says she'll take care of convincing their brother and everyone else back home. Lyra thanks her brother with a smile, and Mars tells her that's exactly why he loves her so much. But then she grabs him in a huge hug, gushing about how cute he is while he struggles to breathe. Once things calm down, Mars asks the girl if she even has a name, but she just looks at him like she's never heard of the concept. So Lyra explains that the girl doesn't have one, and that it's actually up to the person who buys her to give her a name. Mars looks the girl right in the eye and asks if she's willing to come with him. She doesn't hesitate for a second, yelling out that she'll go and do whatever he needs. With the deal settled, Mars tells her that starting today, she's going to have a brand new name, calling her Rin, which leaves the girl standing there in total silence. She repeats the name to herself, looking up at him and asking if that's really what she's called now. Mars smiles and says that's right, explaining he wants her to use that name to grow into a strong and confident woman. Rin's eyes light up with a new sense of purpose as she stares ahead, promising Mars that she'll give it her all and that she's really looking forward to their time together. Thinking back, she remembers the exact day she finally got a name and made a huge life decision, vowing to become a woman worthy of the name Rin, whether it's through sword training or proper manners. She decided right then that she would spend the rest of her life living for Mars' sake. And looking down at him sleeping at his desk, she can't help but think he looks totally adorable. But then she realizes something: Mars hasn't even tried to touch her tail in a while. Her eyes go wide as she realizes where her thoughts are heading, blushing hard, while she tries to tell herself she's a dignified woman, and it's not like that at all. She eventually just smiles and thanks him for everything, while Mars wakes up wondering what's up. Rin sounds a bit confused, so Mars clarifies he's talking about the soup kitchen and how she was the one who really saved their people. She realizes what he's getting at but tells him not to worry about it, sticking to what she said before. Mars leans back, telling her he wouldn't say he's actually saved them just yet, though Rin tries to speak up and argue, but he just brushes it off, saying he's simply had a bit of a change of heart lately. He explains that he figured he might try actually working for a little while, making Rin listen closely as he asks if she remembers how he's basically just lived in luxury his entire life. He feels like he should at least pay back what he owes the world, and then maybe he can get back to slacking off like usual. Rin can't help but giggle, telling him the people back at the royal capital would be absolutely floored if they heard him talk like that, while Mars just stretches out, mentioning how he's been aiming for that slow life ever since that specific day. Looking at his relaxed smile, Rin can't help but feel like Lord Mars has really changed since they first met. Rin tells him that things are fine just the way they are, and as long as he stays as kind as he's always been, she doesn't need anything else, thinking back to the moment they first met, when he was just a kid reaching out a hand to help her. She's made up her mind to protect him with her life, no matter what happens, and it's a feeling she's kept buried deep in her heart since that very first day. Rin looks at Mars and tells herself that this is her vow to him. Meanwhile, Mars is busy getting some work done, calling out an Earth Lance spell that sends massive rock spikes tearing through the dirt. He figures that should be enough to get the field plowed for now, even if it's just a temporary fix until they can get some better soil. The field manager just stands there looking completely stunned, but manages to thank him for the help. Mars shifts his focus to what's next on the list, and mentions how he asked Rin to go out and find some more people to help out around the place. Mars wonders how things are going with the task he gave Lin, but when he checks back, there are 3 new beastmen face down on the ground. He just stands there staring at them, completely thrown off by the sight. Mars asks Lin why these people are groveling in front of him, and she says they wouldn't have it any other way, so he tells them to just stand up and explain who they are, which they quickly agree to. The first girl introduces herself as a dog beastman, saying her nose is perfect for finding ingredients, while the big guy from the lion tribe steps up next, showing off his muscles and saying he's got all the strength they'll need. The last one is a nervous kid from the rabbit tribe who says he's good at sensing sounds, but he's so shaky that he ends up biting his tongue hard, leaving Mars feeling a bit bad for the guy. Mars looks at the group and realizes he still doesn't know who they actually are, so he asks for their names. Lin looks at Mars and explains that these guys don't actually have names because they're slaves. Mars realizes that just means no one has bought them yet, so the three beastmen just stand there looking pretty rough and unsure of what's about to happen to them. Mars takes a good look at the group, his expression getting serious as he thinks things over for a second. He turns to Lin to double-check, asking if she was really the one who went out and picked these three specifically, and she confirms it right away, saying she saw them herself and decided they'd be a good fit for what they need. Mars gets a little smirk on his face and says that if she's the one who chose them, then he's got no problems at all. He looks at the girl with the dog ears first and tells her that her name is Shiro now, which totally catches her off guard. Then he moves on to the big lion guy, telling him that from here on out he's Leo. Finally, he looks at the nervous girl with the rabbit ears and asks if Rabbi works for her name, leaving the three of them standing there in total shock, barely able to process the fact that they actually have names now. Mars gives them a warm smile and confirms that he's being serious about the names, and he tells the group that for now he's going to buy all three of them. Shiro and Rabbi just stand there with their heads down, looking like they're about to break, until the whole group just loses it, crying and yelling with relief and joy because they finally have a home. Lin watches them with a soft smile while Shiro looks back at her, totally overwhelmed by the moment. Mars says he's ready to move forward, and Lin tells the new recruits that starting today, her name is Lin. Her eyes start to sparkle with a brand new kind of energy, like she understands exactly how they feel right now, since she was in their shoes not too long ago. She thanks Mars for trusting her judgment on picking them out, and Mars starts to wrap things up, looking at the three of them as Lin proudly introduces the new team she's put together. Mars gives a subtle, satisfied smile now that everything is settled, and he suddenly shouts out a victory theme like he's in a game, celebrating the fact that three new members just joined the party. The whole group stands together in the cellar, a weird mix of humans and beastmen finally ready to move out. Mars suddenly catches himself and panics, realizing he used the level up song by mistake, while Lin just looks at him totally confused. Seeing him freak out over something so small makes the girls start to relax, and Shiro actually calls him a weirdo to his face, the mood in the room completely shifting from sad to lighthearted. Mars blushes and clears his throat, trying to get his dignity back after that awkward moment. So he pumps his fist and tells the group they're heading out to go hunting right now, which gets an enthusiastic shout from everyone. A little while later, the new party arrives at the thick woods of the Barbara North Forest, and Rabbi starts shaking and admits she's scared. But Shiro stays close and tells her she's got her back while they move through the trees. Mars stands with the group and thinks about how it's been a long time since he felt this kind of vibe, while Rabbi starts groaning and says she really hopes no monsters or anything scary jump out at them. Mars just gives her a little smile and points out they'd actually be in trouble if they don't find anything today, because suddenly Shiro's eyes lock onto something in the brush, and she lets out a small sound of surprise. She kneels down by a patch of green leafy plants and tells everyone that these are actually good to eat. Lin looks impressed and says she gets it, then suggests they should definitely pack them up and bring them back, but Mars looks a bit skeptical and admits the plants just look like normal, everyday grass to his eyes. Lin pokes Shiro on the cheek and explains that the kid has a nose even sharper than hers, so it's totally safe. Mars laughs it off and says that's definitely the dog tribe for you, really impressed with her skills. He tells her that finding food is their biggest priority right now, so having her around to find snacks is a massive help. Shiro looks up at Mars and mentions that everything is just like Lin described, which makes Mars curious, so she explains how Lin told them he's a genuinely kind guy who treats even slaves like normal people. Mars looks over at Lin, who just shrugs and tells him she simply told the new recruits the truth about his personality. The peaceful vibe breaks when a heavy footstep crushes the grass nearby, and Rabbi catches the sound with her ears, screaming out a warning that someone is headed straight for them. Everything goes quiet for a second as they focus on the movement in the trees. Leo yells to get everyone's attention, while Lin orders the whole group to get ready for a fight right now. The bushes ahead start rustling like crazy as the hidden threat finally decides to make its move, and suddenly a huge orc with an axe and a pack of goblins burst out of the brush to ambush them. Mars, Leo, and Lin all lock in with serious looks, prepared to protect the group from the incoming monsters. Lin doesn't waste a second, she draws her blade and cuts right through the front line of the ambush, while Leo lets out a massive roar to keep the pressure on. Mars follows up immediately, calling out a wind spell to blow the rest of the goblins away. The combined force of their attacks completely shreds the monster pack in a single moment, leaving Mars standing there with a satisfied look on his face. He says he finally sees what's going on, then turns to Rabbi to thank her. He tells her that they were only ready for that fight because of her warning, and he doesn't stop there. He makes sure to tell Leo he was amazing too, mentioning how they can definitely trust him to hold down the front line from now on. Rabbi gets all flustered and blushes, stuttering out that her contribution wasn't really that big of a deal, but Mars just laughs it off. He jokes that even he'd be in a rough spot if he got hit by his own magic, while Leo tries to stay humble about the whole thing. Looking over at his new team, Mars tells Lin he's finally starting to see why she chose these three to join them. The new recruits stand together, looking a bit scratched up but totally happy to have proven their worth in a real fight. Rabbi's rabbit ear suddenly twitches as she picks up a faint sound. She points toward the brush and tells Mars that something is moving over there, though it's pretty slow. Mars checks with Lin, who figures that if it's moving at that pace, they're probably looking at a magical beast. Lin asks Shiro if she can smell any blood in the air, but the girl sniffs around and says she doesn't catch anything. Mars decides they should check it out, and they move through the grass. The group hides behind a tree, peeking out to see what made the noise. They find a herd of giant bulls, and Mars tells the girls they did great. Rabbi is just happy she was right about the noise, but Shiro looks a bit worried seeing how many of them there are. Leo mentions these aren't weak like the last monsters they fought and asks Mars what the plan is, so Mars just smiles and thinks it's time to see what this party can do. Mars and the group get their heads in the game. He tells everyone that this time they're doing it for real. Looking out at the field, Mars counts about a dozen of the Orcus beasts just wandering around. He realizes it's a lot to take on, noting that if the whole herd rushes them at once, they'll be in over their heads. Lin chimes in and says they should try to save at least 2 of them for food. She looks at Mars and asks if he can handle it. Mars looks a bit unsure and asks the team what they think the best move is. Lin mentions that they could just use Mars's magic to blast the whole group, but there's a catch. Mars knows his power is too much. He says his magic would just shred the meat into a mess, which isn't exactly a clean kill. Lin stops to think for a second before asking if there's any way they can just split the herd up. The idea catches Mars off guard. He repeats the suggestion to himself while trying to figure out a plan. He watches from the bushes and finally agrees that splitting them up is probably the way to go. Mars stays low in the brush, watching the herd of beasts as they graze in the open field, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike while the animals are still relaxed and totally unaware of the group. He finally makes his move. Mars holds out his hands and starts casting an earth wall spell, causing the ground to shake violently. The beasts start panicking and crying out as the dirt beneath them suddenly erupts. A massive ridge of rock shoots out of the earth, successfully sliding the confused animals apart and splitting the herd right down the middle. Mars keeps his stance firm and tells the team it's time for the follow-up. Lin is seriously impressed. She says that with that wall in the way, the rest of the pack can't help. Leo is standing there stunned until Lin yells at him to stop spacing out because it's his turn. He quickly replies that he's on it. Lin looks at the 2 beasts they managed to isolate and realizes that with a small number, they have a real shot. She shouts that they can definitely take them on as she and Leo ready their weapon. The ground shakes as the beasts slam into the stone barrier, and Lin lets out a startled noise while the rest of the herd piles up against the rock, completely unable to break through. Rabbi starts panicking, saying the wall looks like it's going to snap any second. But Mars just tells her everything is fine because he's not going to let that happen. He reaches out his hand, promising that the wall will hold as long as he keeps pouring his mana into it. So he presses both palms flat against the stone surface. The heavy beasts are stuck on the other side, unable to move forward even as they shove their faces hard against the barrier, trying to find a way through. Mars decides to enhance the structure even more to make sure it doesn't budge at all. Lin watches from the side as the plan actually works. 2 of the beasts are totally cut off, and Leo doesn't waste a single second, lunging forward and slamming his weapon down on the target. The momentum shifts instantly as a fighter lunges forward with total precision, landing a brutal strike that connects right with the beast's jaw, ending the threat. Shiro and Lin celebrate the victory while Mars looks over at them, saying the fight is finally over. Lin looks back at Mars with a bit of guilt, telling him she's sorry for making him do so much heavy lifting, but Mars just shrugs it off, telling her it was no big deal and felt like a breeze. As the magic barrier starts to break apart and fade from the air, Lin just stares, noting that holding off a whole pack of orcs with a wall that doesn't even budge is insane, calling his power terrifying. Mars rubs the back of his head, admitting he doesn't actually know where his own limits are yet. But then he realizes someone is missing, looking around and asking where Leo went. Leo appears out of nowhere right behind them, and Mars nearly loses it from the scare. Leo is seriously impressed, telling Mars that taking down 2 orcs so easily was amazing, but Mars just shrugs it off, saying it really wasn't a big deal. Leo hoists an orc over his shoulder and insists this is nothing compared to his lord's magic. Mars tries to stay humble, claiming he couldn't even pull off a feat of strength like that, and then decides it's time to split up. He tells Leo to take Shiro and Rabbi and head back to the village ahead of him. He explains that the magic wall will likely break if he moves too far away, so he'll just catch up with Rin a bit later. Leo nods and says he's got it, while Shiro looks back and tells Mars to be careful out there. Mars watches as the 3 of them head off with the day's haul, leaving him and Rin behind. Once they're gone, Mars turns to the wall and asks Rin if she's ready to move, and she tells him she's good whenever he is. Mars prepares to drop the barrier, saying he's going to cut off the mana flow right now. The massive magic wall stands firm against the cliff for one last second before a sudden loud noise rings out, catching both Mars and Rin completely off guard. A massive bull monster suddenly breaks through the trees, charging forward with insane speed. It heads straight for them, kicking up a huge cloud of dust and leaving them no time to think as Mars looks over, sweating as he realizes he messed up. He tells Rin he's sorry and knows she's probably mad. Rin doesn't waste any time, yelling that she's moving now. She scoops Mars up, and he lets out a high-pitched shriek. Mars is completely embarrassed, thinking about how he just sounded like a girl and wondering if he's actually okay with this. He ends up pressed right against Rin while she carries him away from the danger. He just gives up and decides to roll with it, watching the ground fly by as Rin sprints towards safety. They finally reach the stone walls of the settlement, and someone mentions they should be safe now that they've made it this far. The monster won't follow them since those things usually stay away from places where humans live anyway. So Mars catches his breath and says how scary that was, but Rin just smiles, thinking the whole chase was a total thrill. Leo comes running out to meet them, shouting that he's glad they made it back safe. Mars just nods and says yeah. He thanks the whole group for waiting and lets them know they're finally all set on food. Turning to the girl beside him, Mars makes sure to tell Rin she did a great job too. The new recruits look a bit unsure, with Shiro and Rabbi nervously asking if they were actually helpful during the hunt. Mars doesn't hesitate at all, giving them a big smile and saying yeah, of course they were. He starts thinking about how well the team works, with Leo holding things down in the vanguard, and Shiro and Rabbi doing such a solid job with all the scouting and gathering. With Rin acting as the commander in the middle and himself covering the back, Mars is pretty satisfied, thinking about how having a balanced party like this is the most important thing. The city walls finally come into view, and Mars tells the crew it's time to head back and celebrate with a huge feast. The crowd in the city starts buzzing the second they see him, shouting that the Lord is finally back. Mars walks through the gates with a huge pack, yelling out that he brought back another big catch for today. People are crowding around, and someone in the front starts telling everyone to make way so he can get through. Mars just gives them a wave and a smile, promising he'll share the food with the whole town a bit later on. Yoru comes running over looking pretty relieved, telling Mars he's just glad to see him back safe and sound. Mars says he's back and asks Yoru to fill everyone in on the details, which Yoru says he's happy to handle. The sun begins to set over the town as everyone heads back to the Lord's Manor to settle in. Once they're back, Mars tells the whole team they did a solid job today, though the recruits insist they're the lucky one. Rin turns to Mars and asks if she can take the new guys over to the guild hall, explaining that her plan is to get them all registered as official adventurers so they can start working for real. Mars tells Lin that he thinks her plan is a great idea since they're all being pretty flexible about it. Lin turns to Shiro, Leo, and Rabbi, telling the three of them to follow her so they can get moving. Mars stays behind and watches the group head out through the manor gates to handle their business, cracking his knuckles. He decides it's time to get to work on a special reward for everyone for later. He stands out in the yard, thinking about how he was told he could use the garden however he wanted, with a smirk on his face. He makes up his mind to just go for it and do whatever he feels like. He starts things off by using his earth magic to tear up the ground and dig a massive hole. Looking it over, he wonders if it's deep enough, figuring it should be just the right size for about 8 people. Next, he holds out his hand and uses water magic to start filling the whole thing up. And then, he realizes that if he just warms the water up with some fire magic, he can turn the hole into a hot tub. Mars finishes up his work and announces that the open-air bath is finally done. He stands there looking at it for a second before realizing it's just one big mixed bath, so he decides to divide the whole thing down the middle with some more magic, and then he adds outer walls to keep it private, finally happy with how perfect everything looks now. The guy lets out a massive yawn since he's totally wiped from all that work. He sits down on a bench and says he's getting sleepy, thinking about how hard he went today. It doesn't take long for his eyes to start fluttering shut as he drifts off right there. While he's half asleep, he starts thinking that whatever he's leaning on feels pretty good. He stays in that daze, wondering to himself if he's actually touching something fluffy, but something startles him and his eye snaps wide open as he wonders what's going on. Rin looks down with a heavy blush and asks if he's finally awake. Mars looks back up at her, completely red in the face, as he stammers out a quiet good morning, slowly realizing he's been sleeping right on her lap this whole time. Rin tells him she was pretty surprised he knocked out, but she was worried he'd catch a cold, so she stayed there using her tails to keep him warm. Mars finally puts it together, realizing that all that fluffy comfort was just her fur. Rin gets all shy and tells him that touching her like that is a bit much, which makes Mars totally freak out and yell a massive apology. He mentions it's been a long time, but Rin reminds him that he actually used to touch her tails all the time. The guy stops for a second as it clicks. He remembers that she's actually right about how they used to be. He recalls how Silk used to get so mad at him for it, mostly because touching those tails is basically like touching her skin, so he just gives an awkward laugh. Rin looks away and quietly mentions that it's not like she actually dislikes it, leaving Mars just nodding along until she smiles and says that if it's only once in a while, she doesn't mind at all. Rin gives him a sweet smile and agrees to the plan, saying she'll go ahead and do just that. She then suggests they head over to the town square to get some food, letting Mars know that everyone else has been working hard while he was knocked out. Mars looks pretty embarrassed about oversleeping and says he's actually ashamed of himself, but Rin just changes the subject. She looks over at him and says, by the way, pointing out that it looked like Mars was building something earlier. She asks what it was exactly, so Mars looks at the stone structure and asks if she means that one. He gets a little smirk on his face and starts to explain the situation, telling her it's actually going to be a surprise for when those three get back. He lets out a breath, looking up at the building, and eventually they make it down to the town square. Mars looks around the busy area, noticing that humans and beastmen are all working together side by side. He realizes things are moving along well, but then Leo and Shiro show up. Leo explains that he actually took the liberty of using Mars' name to get things handled. Leo lays down the law to the workers, telling them straight up that if they can't get along, they aren't getting fed. The threat definitely works because the humans nearby look pretty shaken. Silk takes a look at the situation and says she gets it, and that she's actually fine with how things are being handled, even though Mars admits he was a little too pushy to make this work. He tells Lin and Silk that he doesn't expect everyone to become best friends overnight, but Silk just agrees with him. She says if fixing these problems were that simple, things would have gotten better a long time ago. She trails off for a second, and then Shiro looks over at the humans and beastmen standing together in line. She says it's actually not a bad sight to see everyone coexisting like this. Just then, one of the workers spots Mars standing nearby and loses it. He yells out to the whole crowd that Lord Mars has showed up, and everyone starts crowding around him. They thank him over and over, saying that because of him, there's finally enough food for everyone to eat. Mars gets a bit modest and tells them to hold on, explaining that all this progress wasn't just his doing alone. He wants them to know it was a team effort, so the mood shifts to a total celebration. Someone yells out that it's time to stop talking and start the feast, and the whole crowd starts cheering, letting the Beastmen workers finally relax and stuff their faces with bread, looking totally relieved. The local guys are out in the street celebrating and drinking together, just as Shiro runs up to Mars. She yells out his name and excitedly shows him a plate of food she brought over. Mars thanks her as she explains that she made a special herb-roasted dish using the stuff they gathered earlier. So Mars says he gets it and tells her it's time to eat, taking a big bite of the food right away, and he's totally floored. He says it's delicious, and Shiro just laughs, saying she's just happy she could help him out. Mars realizes that's why she knew exactly which herbs were edible back then, and Shiro explains the trick. She says grilling the herbs with the meat locks and the juices and makes everything super tender. Mars looks at her and asks where she actually learned to cook like that, causing Shiro to look away for a second. She admits that she was originally a slave in charge of the cooking, which is why she still has all that knowledge, even if her past was pretty rough. Shiro explains that even when she saw good food being wasted, she'd just get yelled at for speaking up, so Mars nods as she admits that back then, she wasn't even allowed to eat when she was starving. It got to the point where she felt like there was no reason to even tell anyone how she felt. But things are different now. Tears start hitting the floor as she tells Mars that because of him, she's finally able to eat. Mars just watches her, seeing how much this actually means to her. He tells her to stop the crying and try to smile since she's happy, and Shiro quickly wipes her eyes, giving him a huge grin. He tells her to go ahead and grab some food, and she cheers while heading off. Mars watches her join the other Beastmen kids who are all standing around eating together. Lin mentions that seeing them like that brings back memories, which catches Mars off guard, and she looks on with a soft expression, admitting she used to think the exact same way Shiro did. Lin finishes her story about the past, mentioning how she felt like there was just no point in resisting back then. Mars listens quietly and tells her he gets it. Finally understanding the kind of life she and the others had before, he comments on how there's clearly still a lot of hidden talent waiting to be found out in the world. Lin smiles, saying that finding that talent was exactly why she chose those kids, and Mars can't help but think about how reliable she's become. He decides it's time to lighten the mood and tells everyone to eat until they're full. So the whole group starts diving into the feast while the locals shout out about all the fresh fruit and veggies they brought for the party. As the sun goes down, Voices fill the air with people saying the food was amazing and thanking the prince for everything. The celebration eventually winds down and things get quiet around the manor inside. Mars gathers the 3 new Beastmen recruits and calls out to Leo, Shiro, and Rabbi. He looks them right in the eyes and tells them that from this day forward, they're going to be living there with him. The 3 of them just stand there completely frozen, eyes wide and jaws dropped, trying to wrap their heads around the offer. Leo stammers out a question about everyone living together, and Rabbi reminds Mars that they're supposed to be slaves. They look down at themselves, clearly feeling like they don't belong in a place like this. Mars just gives them a kind look and sets things straight, telling them that even though he bought them, they aren't slaves anymore. He tells them if they're worried about being dirty, they can just go wash up, and besides, he's already got Lin on the job. She yells out a quick response and lets the group know the bath is already good to go. The trio looks like they've seen a ghost. The idea of a hot bath is just too much to handle. Mars points toward the steaming water, mentioned it's a bit small but there's a wall separating the guys and girls. Suddenly the kids start breaking down and Mars is left wondering why they're getting so emotional. Rabbi starts crying for real, saying she's never had anyone do so much for her and the others can't help but feel the same way. Shiro looks like she's on cloud 9, saying the whole experience feels just like a dream. Mars is a little taken aback by the intensity, asking her if she really feels that way, and Lin jumps in to back her up, telling Lord Mars that Shiro is totally right. While Rabbi tries to pull herself together, Lin starts thinking back to her own past. She gets this soft look on her face as she remembers the very first time Mars gave her a bath a long time ago. She admits she was just so happy back then, and you can see her tail wagging like crazy just from the memory of it. Mars gives her a warm smile and tells Lin she should go ahead and jump in with the other girls. She gets a bit flustered but quickly says yes, so the group finally gets settled into the hot water. A big sigh of relief fills the air as someone mentions how amazing the soak feels. Leo is definitely enjoying himself, leaning back with his eyes closed and saying the water feels great. Mars relaxes against the rocks with a towel on his head, thinking the whole setup isn't bad at all for something they just threw together. But even with the rush, the view of the starry night sky is seriously impressive. He's just taking it all in when he hears the girls laughing and having a great time on the other side of the divider, sounding like they're finally having some fun. The girls are loving the hot water, with Shiro shouting about how good it feels while Lin giggles and agrees. Rabbi is just soaking it all in, mentioning that this is actually her very first time in a bath. On the other side of the wall, Mars closes his eyes and thinks about how glad he is to see everyone so happy. But he can't help but wonder if he's actually getting any closer to living that quiet, slow life he wanted. Even though he loves seeing them smile, hearing Shiro say this feels like a dream makes him ask if she really means it. And seeing their reaction makes him realize just how badly these guys must have been treated before he found them. He decides right then and there that as their lord, he has to do better. So he makes a silent promise to himself to work even harder for the sake of all the beastmen. Moving away from the camp to a large estate at night, Silk looks completely blindsided as she repeats the news she just heard. Her engagement with Lord Mars is being called off. Silk is totally shaken up and asks if he really wants her to just wait around. Her father confirms it, saying it's a direct order coming straight from the king himself. Silk is caught off guard and asks what her father actually said about the whole situation. So the Marquis looks her in the eye and explains that if Mars can actually prove himself as a lord, then the king promised he wouldn't just throw their engagement away like it was nothing. Silk can barely believe it as she repeats the word result back to him, looking like she finally has a bit of hope. Her father mentions he's heading out there in 2 weeks and asks if she wants to join, but he warns her that seeing how lazy the prince usually is, the reality of the situation might be pretty rough. Without hesitating for even a second, Silk yells out that she's definitely going. Her dad is surprised by how fast she answered and tells her she needs to stop the crying and get herself together. Silk's father calls out from the hallway saying Mars is going to worry about her when they finally meet. Silk gives him a quick yes sir, and then the door slams shut as he leaves her alone. She stands there thinking about the situation, realizing just how kind Mars actually is. It makes her look back on everything, and she remembers the moment Mars made her realize a huge truth. Thinking about him and Lin together, she finally understood that beastmen are really just humans like the rest of them. She looks back at when she first saw them together and how she had pleaded to have Lin brought to her. Looking at how things are now, Silk is absolutely positive that Mars has a special kind of power. She can feel it, knowing he's the only one with the strength to really change things for the better. This realization hits her hard, and she tells herself that she can't just sit around and do nothing anymore. She needs to be ready for when they meet again, so she plans to take a bath, get some food, and finally get some decent sleep. It's time to get her life back together, because she's determined to do everything in her power to support him when the time comes. Mars is having a wild dream where someone is desperately chasing after him, yelling for him to wait up, and it turns out to be Eris, who's shouting at the top of her lungs that she's not going to let him get away. Back in the real world, Lin is just standing there looking confused while Mars is clearly struggling in his sleep. And someone starts shaking him, telling him it's time to wake up, but he just drools and asks for a few more minutes. The person waking him is losing patience, pointing out that he already said that exact same thing a second ago. Mars is still half asleep and mumbles something about Shiro and Rabbi, acting like he's got a plan for staying in bed, so Eris decides to take matters into her own hands and pokes him right in the side, making him jump and freak out. She gives him a casual good morning while he's squirming around, complaining about how much that actually tickled. He finally blinks his eyes open and takes a good look at who's standing in the room with him, and he's totally blown away, telling Rabbi she looks like a completely different person in her new outfit while she just laughs. Lin mentions that these are the servant clothes from the manor, and Shiro is totally losing it. She's never worn anything this cute before, and Mars is right there with her, laughing and agreeing that she looks great while everyone just keeps talking about the new look. Lin points out that with their cool ears and tails, it would be a huge waste to just stick to their old clothes. But Shiro gets so excited that her tail starts wagging like crazy, making Lin look over with a really serious face. She warns Shiro to settle down so her tail doesn't end up lifting her skirt too high. Moving on, Lin tells both the girls that they need to start learning how to behave like real ladies from now on. And she adds a warning that Master Mars is actually a total tail groper, so they definitely need to be on their guard. Mars hears the whole thing and starts panicking, yelling for them to wait a minute while Shiro just looks on in total shock. He tries to laugh it off and asks Rin if she isn't being a little bit too hard on him this morning, but she doesn't even look at him, just closing her eyes and saying it's really nothing special. Mars is sitting down for a meal when he realizes someone is missing. He looks up and asks where Leo went. Lin tells him that Leo already headed out to train. Apparently the guy didn't like the servant clothes because they were too stiff, so he went back to his old gear to get some work in, which is fine since Lin plans on making him the mansion's main guard anyway. Next, Lin introduces Rabbi as Mars's new caretaker and her own personal assistant. Mars keeps it friendly and tells her it's nice to meet her. As for Shiro, she's going to be an apprentice chef. Mars is already testing the results and says the food is actually delicious. Mars realizes he kind of just decided everyone's jobs on his own, so he stops for a second and asks Lin if she's actually okay with all this. He gives her a big smile and tells her that the only reason he feels okay making these calls is because he trusts her so much. That really hits home for Lin. She just stands there for a second, totally wide-eyed and blushing after hearing that. She hides her face and admits she's a sucker for that kind of talk, but Mars just laughs to himself about being such a pushover. Lin quickly gets back to business, mentioning the 9 o'clock bell is about to ring and they need to hurry since the representatives are waiting. Mars is finishing up his meal when it suddenly hits him. He stops eating and mentions that he totally forgot about something. Rabbi looks pretty surprised as Mars explains what's on his mind. Someone asks if he's talking about the people in charge, and he confirms it's the slave traders and owners he needs to deal with. He heads over to the meeting hall, thinking about how tense the room is. All the big shots gathered there are sweating bullets and looking completely stressed out as they wait. Mars steps up to start the meeting. He keeps it polite, acknowledging that everyone is probably busy and thanking them for actually showing up today. He's playing the part of the respectful prince, though the vibe in the room stays pretty heavy. One of the guys in the crowd points out that he's still a prince regardless of how he acts. Mars just stands there with Lin, looking at the nervous faces in front of him. He honestly admits that acting all high and mighty just isn't his style, which only makes the crowd more confused. They start whispering about how weird he is, wondering if he's going to end slavery or if they're all about to be punished. To clear the air, Mars tells them he has no plan to give beastmen any kind of special treatment. Mars tells the room that his goal is simple. He just wants to give the beastmen their legitimate rights. The older merchant looks completely lost, repeating the phrase like he's never heard those words put together before. Mars keeps his cool and explains that it's not complicated at all. He's just talking about the basics, like proper food, a place to live, and actually giving them some time to rest. He asks the crowd if they don't get exhausted after working a full day, because the truth is, these beastmen feel the exact same way they do. The merchants start to panic, and one guy yells out that the work will never get finished if they start letting people take breaks. They're getting pretty heated now. Another guy shouts that the food they're giving the beastmen costs money and isn't just free. Mars listens and says he gets where they're coming from, but he points out that taking breaks actually makes people work better and faster in the end. He doesn't stop there. He asks the group if they're even paying these people a fair wage for the kind of work they're doing, while looking at the beastmen struggling with heavy carts and picks. He makes it clear that anyone can see how brutal this manual labor is. The merchants look like they're about to have a heart attack. They start whining about why they should have to change anything, especially when it's going to wreck their profits. Mars has a quick solution for their money problem. He suggests they could just stop paying for so many guards since they won't be needed anymore. Mars starts his rebuttal, but the merchants immediately push back, claiming that giving the beastmen rights will just lead to a revolt. Mars doesn't buy it at all and asks them if a revolt would even be a possibility if they had treated people right from the start. He shuts them down by saying that their fear is basically proof they know they've been doing something terrible this whole time, leaving the merchants sweating and unable to argue back. With the room quiet, Mars starts laying out his new set of rules. He makes it very clear that starting right now, a lunch break is absolutely mandatory for every worker. To make sure there are no excuses, he tells them he's bringing in specialists to make the food so it won't cost the merchants a single cent. He even goes as far as promising to pay for any lost work time caused by these breaks, making sure the business owners have zero room to complain. The main merchant can only stammer out that he's okay with it if Mars is covering everything. Mars claps his hands together to end the meeting, though he mentions they'll be having much tougher talks about wages and hours very soon. Before they leave, he drops one last warning with a sharp smile, telling them exactly what's coming if they try to cheat the system. Mars decides to skip the talk and just summons a massive fireball right over his head. The sheer heat freaks the merchants out immediately. One guy starts screaming while the other yells about how crazy hot it is, so Mars just stands there and tells them to imagine what would happen if he actually dropped it on them. He stares them down with a cold look, asking if his request is really that hard to follow, and then he explains that he's only looking for them to do things the right way, the way they're supposed to be done. The lead merchant is totally terrified at this point, grunting in fear before shouting out that he'll do whatever he says. With the point made, Mars tells them they're dismissed, and the merchants practically trip over themselves to get out of there. Once the room is finally empty, Mars lets out a huge sigh of relief as all that intensity just vanishes. He slumps over and tells Lin he's wiped out, while she tells him he did great. He can't help but wonder if that was the right move, thinking back on how these problems were just as messy in his old world. Mars thinks back to the nightmare of his past life news reports about people dying from overwork and bosses losing it over simple mistakes, making him realize how different things are now. Lin mentions she thought feeding the new beastmen first was the right call since they're tough and should recover fast, and Mars totally agrees. The next morning, Mars is up early stretching and suggests they all head out for another hunt. Lin watches him, mentioning how he's a seriously hard worker, but then he stops in his tracks when he spots Yor waiting for them. He's surprised to see her out here, but she just smiles and says they've been waiting for him. She introduces her subordinate Max and tells the guy to speak up, which leads to Max absolutely losing it. He screams at the top of his lungs about what a huge honor it is to finally meet Mars. He's so loud his name basically echoes off the walls. He stands tall and announces that he's Yor's lieutenant, making Mars give a casual hello while wondering why they're all standing there. He asks what's actually going on, and Yor gets straight to the point. She asks if he can take these knights along on his hunt today, but Mars is confused and asks why she'd even want that. Instead of saying it out loud, Yor leans in close to whisper the real deal in his ear, leaving Lin and the others just standing there watching. Yor whispers the real situation to Mars, explaining that these knights actually come from the most powerful families in the city, and because of their background, they're pretty skeptical about how Mars is handling things. He nods along, asking where she's going with this, so she suggests he take the knights with him on the hunt to prove once and for all how helpful beastmen are. Shiro and Rabbi look a bit worried while Yor points out that keeping beastmen stuck doing nothing but house chores is just a huge waste of potential. Honestly, she admits Mars even changed her own mind. She looks over at Lin and says she never realized the girl was actually that skilled until now, but she truly believes that with Mars and his new crew working together, they can really start making things better in the territory. Mars listens to her plan and gives a small smile. He says he gets it and agrees to take the knights along, but as soon as he says that, Leo lets out a roar. He yells that protecting Mars is his job and his job alone, making Max lose his mind and scream right back. He shouts that there's no way he's letting a beastman handle the protection detail, and then he starts ranting about not being dirty just for liking beastmen. Mars just holds up his hands to try and keep the peace before a fight breaks out. Mars turns to the group and tells them he appreciates their enthusiasm, but for today, he just wants them to stay back and watch. Then he looks right at Leo and tells him he really needs to keep that temper of his under control. Mars gives him a smile and asks him to do it just for his sake, so Leo looks down and apologizes while Max just laughs nervously, leaving the two of them standing there with these serious, determined looks on their faces. Mars just shakes his head with a small smile, thinking good grief, as he watches them get ready. The group finally makes it deep into the northern forest near Barbara, But the peaceful walk doesn't last long because a rabbi suddenly freaks out and screams that she hears something coming right for them. Lin doesn't waste a second and tells everyone to stay alert as she prepares for a fight, but Leo is already ahead of her, stepping up with a grin and saying he's going to take the lead. Just then, a bunch of goblins jump out of the brush with their weapons raised, ready to scrap. Leo and Lin absolutely wreck the goblin squad, showing off some crazy strength while Mars just watches. Max looks on and admits he's impressed, seeing how well the whole team is moving together. Shiro finds some edible grass and gets all excited, making Max realize that beastmen are just on another level when it comes to the wild. Mars tells everyone he'll be right back and wanders off, but right then, Leo senses something and yells that a big one is coming. Suddenly, this massive wild bull bursts out of the trees, catching Mars completely off guard. Shiro screams that the bulls are right on top of Mars, while the other guards panic and call out for Max to help. Max is just standing there frozen, totally shocked by the size of the thing. The creature is so big it's actually terrifying, and you can see the guy's legs shaking just looking at it. The whole forest shakes as the beast steps forward. Lin screams for Mars to watch out, but he just stands there acting like it's no big deal. Mars doesn't even flinch as the beast closes in, he just stands there with a calm look on his face. Lin, on the other hand, is completely losing it, watching the monster get way too close for comfort. Just as the bull is about to hit, a pair of sharp teeth bared in a snarl show up from the side. Leo launches himself forward like a blur, moving so fast the guards can barely track him. He gets right in the path of the charging bull, meeting the massive creature head-on and shouts as he puts everything into a single strike, while Lin can only watch the sheer power he's putting out. The hit lands with enough force to shatter the bull's teeth, sending them flying everywhere as the beast's head snaps back. Leo stands tall over the downed monster, not looking tired at all after dropping a creature that big. The guards standing nearby are totally floored, stuttering out that what they just saw was absolutely amazing. One of them just keeps staring in silence, shaking a bit after seeing that kind of raw beastman strength. Lin looks pretty stressed out as she tells Mars her heart almost stopped when he told her to just wait back there. Mars just gives her a casual smile and explains he mostly wanted to give Leo a chance to show off his strength to the guards. He doesn't stop there though, adding another reason for why he stayed so calm with a huge grin. He says that even if there was some tiny, slim chance that Leo didn't make it to the monster in time, he knew for a fact that Lin would have stepped in and saved the day regardless. Hearing that, Lin just stares at him with her eyes sparkling. She's totally blushing from the compliment. Leo lets out a laugh and tells Mars he's actually pretty devious for planning things out like that, while the group finally makes their way back to the safety of the massive stone city walls. Yor is right there at the entrance to welcome Lord Mars back, and Mars happily tells him that he's home. Mars points out that even though they finished up a bit early, the mission was a huge success. Yor just smiles, saying he's glad things went well. Max turns to Leo and asks him what he thinks of the situation so far, but Max stays quiet for a second, just looking at the group as he thinks about how impressive Shiro is for being able to sort through food using nothing but her scent, and how Rabbi can pick up on enemies or even the smallest sounds from a distance. But Max admits that Leo's sheer power was the thing that really stood out the most. Leo looks away, admitting it's pretty annoying, but he can't deny that the knights are actually strong. Max gives a small smile and says he's glad Leo finally gets it, though he adds that Leo really needs to wrap his head around the whole situation himself. He reminds Leo that Lord Mars is doing everything he can to save them, so they shouldn't get in his way. Leo finally drops the attitude and bows, apologizing for being so disrespectful this whole time. Max double-checks the lion beastman's name, and Leo sounds a bit caught off guard while confirming it, which leads to Max offering a sincere apology for his earlier behavior. Leo looks away, admitting that for now, he can at least respect how strong Max is. The two of them finally shake on it. Leo gives a quiet grunt as Max accepts the gesture, both of them moving past their grudge. Mars stands nearby watching the whole thing go down, feeling pretty good about the group finally bonding. He thinks to himself that this is a solid step forward for everyone's relationship in the territory. Later on, Mars meets up with the guys and apologizes to Leo and Max for calling them out for a meeting so suddenly. Leo doesn't seem to mind at all, casually asking the boss what he needs from them this time. Mars is totally thrown off by the new title, but Leo just explains that since Mars is his big sister's master, it only makes sense. It finally clicks for Mars that Leo looks up to Lin as an older sister figure, though Lin makes things even more awkward by bragging about how Mars dropped her with a single punch the first time they met. Mars thinks to himself that calling him boss is actually fine since he's the lord of the land, and Max clears his throat and asks if it's just him and Leo involved. While Leo asks what the plan is, Mars smiles and tells them he's actually thinking about starting to feed the slaves lunch every day, and he makes sure to add that the same goes for all the humans living in the town as well. Leo points out that giving them meals will make the work go faster and give everyone some breathing room. Plus, he mentions that by hiring local people to do all the cooking, those people will be able to make a much better living for themselves too. Max is pretty surprised, realizing this is a policy to see if he can actually jumpstart the local economy, so the guys tell him they see what he's doing and think it's a really great idea, which makes Mars smile, telling them he's just glad they're on board with the plan. Mars looks them in the eye and tells them he wants the two of them to start hunting together starting today, and he explains that they'll be working as a mixed party made up of both beast folk and humans. Leo and Max just stand there in silence for a second, looking pretty stressed about the whole idea. Leo finally says he gets it and promises the boss that he'll hold back his hatred for now to make things work, while Max backs him up, saying he feels the same way and promises he'll never treat the slaves unfairly no matter what happens. Mars gives them a small smile and thanks them both for being willing to try, so he tells them to go ahead and start getting the rest of their allies together for the trip. Once they're gone, Lin turns to Mars and asks what the two of them should be doing next. So Mars says he's definitely coming along this time because they might run into an emergency they can't handle alone. The sun shines over the high stone walls as they prepare for the next move. Leo walks up to Mars and tells him he's managed to get everyone together for the time being. He points out that, just to be clear, these specific beastmen are the ones who don't really hate humans, making it Max's turn to speak up, as he tells Lord Mars that things are pretty much the same on his side. He explains that he went ahead and gathered the soldiers who have the least amount of prejudice against beastmen, so both groups just stand there facing each other, and Mars can't help but notice how incredibly awkward the vibe is. Max looks past the beastmen and asks Lord Mars who exactly those other people standing behind him are. Mars looks back at the group of regular guys and explains that he hired them to work as porters, and he clarifies that their job is to clear out the forest and help bring back all the lumber they need. Max realizes what's happening and asks if that means they're acting as guards, which Mars confirms is spot on. Mars then turns his attention over to Leo and asks the guy if he actually knows why they're doing this. Leo looks over at Mars and asks if they need to work together to keep the workers safe, which Mars confirms by saying he doesn't expect perfection yet since this is just a trial run. So the whole group starts moving out into the woods together, their footsteps hitting the dirt as Rabbi's ears suddenly twitch and she yells out a warning that something is heading their way. Max is shocked as a pack of goblins jumps out of nowhere, sending the porters into a panic. He tells everyone to keep their cool and reminds them that these goblins aren't a threat. Then Max calls out to the whole group as the soldiers and beastmen prepare to take the monsters on. He gives the order to double up on the enemies to take them down fast and for sure. Leo gets hyped and lets out a massive shout to rally the warriors of the Bear Clan, yelling for his people to scatter their enemies while he jumps into the fray with a heavy hit. Mars is seriously impressed by what he's seeing. Lin just nods and says it'd be a huge help to have that kind of strength on their side. A massive, furry arm grips onto a tree trunk. The wood starts cracking under the sheer pressure of Leo showing off his crazy beastman power. He's basically clearing the path by hand, moving heavy stuff like it's nothing while Rabbi points out more enemies coming from the side. Max doesn't skip a beat, leaning in to clock a goblin right in the face as Mars watches the teamwork and thinks it's exactly what people mean when they talk about having the right person for the job. But Rabbi's ears suddenly twitch again. She's picking up a sound that's way different from before, something much heavier, and she loses it, yelling to Mars that something massive is heading straight for them. Mars looks over, caught off guard by how fast things changed. He shouts for Leo and Max to get in position and protect the workers. They both yell back that they're on it. The ground starts shaking as these giant feet stomp down, crushing logs and dirt with every single step. Mars just stares, sweating a bit as he tries to process the size of the monster that just showed up. Mars looks pretty stressed while Lin explains that all the noise from uprooting trees must have lured the monsters straight to them. Right then, a massive gray beast steps out from the woods, making it clear that they're dealing with a real troll. Lin and Mars stand their ground against the giant, both of them processing the fact that a troll is actually standing right there. The thing is a high-ranking monster, way different from the small fries they usually see, and it turns out it's so tough that normally only veteran adventurers can even manage to leave a scratch on its skin. But it's not just about how strong it is. This thing is also known for being a total glutton, and the problem is that if it's left alone to do whatever it wants, it'll apparently just keep going until it devours every single magical beast in the entire area, leaving nothing behind. Mars notices the monster has its fist clenched and asks if it's holding something, which makes Lin's face go pale as Mars gets a good look at the creature's hand. It's holding a dead gerbil like it's nothing but a snack. The workers start panicking at the sight of the monster, but Max yells for them to stay calm and promises they won't lose, even as Leo gets fired up and says he'll take the thing on himself. which leads to Lin telling him to just relax for a second. Lin admits the situation is serious, and Leo points out that if someone like them doesn't step up, everyone is in trouble. Lin looks at the massive creature and says, "My goodness," clearly feeling the pressure as the troll stares them down. The monster just stands there like it's waiting for them to move, almost like it's telling them to just watch what it does next. Suddenly, the beast opens its mouth wide and lets out a roar that shakes the whole forest, and right then it just keeps screaming at the group, showing off how huge and dangerous it actually is compared to them. The workers in the back start losing their minds and screaming, while Mars just stands there looking completely shocked by the sight. Lin notices he's frozen up and yells for him to pull himself together. She's clearly worried about him. Mars finally snaps out of it enough to mention the dead Jerba, realizing just how brutal this monster really is. Mars looks at the beast and remembers eating one back before his old memories returned. He realizes it's just a magical beast that looks like a giant ostrich. Suddenly the creature's eye flashes wide, it's ready to move, but Mars isn't even worried, mostly just thinking about how the thing probably tastes like chicken. He lets loose a wind pressure attack that slams into the monster with insane force, leaving the giant beast to just start crumbling away into nothing right in front of them. Lin can't believe her eyes, she's completely stunned by how much power he's actually hiding. Even Mars is a bit surprised, thinking to himself that the attack went a little further than he expected, but Leo and the guys are hyped, yelling for everyone to look at how strong their boss is. Max joins in the cheering, telling the whole crowd that Lord Mars is the one who just saved them all. Mars stands there looking down for a second, just taking everything in. He starts laughing because a perfect idea just hit him while looking at the bird. With a huge smile, Mars tells everyone that chicken was his favorite food back in his old life, and he figures since they have the meat, he might as well try cooking that one special dish again. He gets so caught up in the thought of a good meal that Lin has to tell him he's literally drooling, but then he snaps out of it, realizing they have so much gear that they're going to be late for lunch. Mars doesn't want to wait, so he orders Leo to take the meat and run back to camp ahead of everyone. Leo hesitates, worried about who's going to keep the rest of the beastmen in line while he's gone, but the older lion beastman steps up with a serious look and tells Leo he'll take over the leadership. Mars isn't so sure about that, just looking at the guy and wondering if he's actually up for the job. Lin steps forward to introduce the massive beastman standing with them, explaining that he's Bearson from the bear tribe. She tells Mars that Bearson is their leader, and since he's old friends with Leo, his strength is pretty much a sure thing. Leo asks Bearson if he's actually sure about this, but Mars just watches the big guy thinking he looks like a man they can really trust. Leo starts laughing, totally hyped that they can finally be friends again just like the old days. He asks for forgiveness, and Bearson apologizes too, feeling bad he ever thought Leo was a traitor. They scream and grab hands in a handshake so intense it makes Mars think they're doing way too much. Mars is still processing the chaos when Leo suddenly begs him to make Bearson the commander instead, and Lin speaks up to say she backs that recommendation too. Mars is pretty surprised to hear that, and he mentions he actually tried to recruit Bearson once before, but the big guy turned him down flat. He says he gets it now, and since his friends trust the guy, he's all in too. Mars shakes his hand and says it's good to meet him, then asks if Bearson has a real name besides just Bear. The big guy looks back at the group and confirms he does, a name his mother gave him before they were both caught by humans. He admits that after his mom died, he started hating every human alive. Lin asks why he'd ever volunteer to lead under a human prince then. Bearson looks right at Mars and tells them it's because he really respected the guts Mars showed when he faced that massive troll without any fear just to save everyone else. Mars just laughs nervously since he actually just thought the troll would taste like chicken. Mars notices something and asks Lin why she's being so polite when she talks to Bearson, but then he gets his answer when Lin explains that the big guy is actually older than her. Mars nods along, mentioning how it's basically impossible to tell how old a beastman is just by looking at them. And Lin adds that for people who used to be slaves, most don't even have a clue when they were born, but she knows for a fact she's 20, while Bearson is actually 23. She goes down the list for the rest of the crew. Leo is 18, Shiro is 13. And Little Rabbi is only about 10, leaving Mars processing all the new info, though there's still one specific thing about Bearson that's really bugging him. He leans in and asks if bearfolk actually like honey as much as the stories say, and Bearson completely freezes up before desperately asking Mars if he actually knows where to find some. Lin just watches them, asking Mars if he's been digging through those old books again to find out random facts like that. Bearson is leaning in close, asking Mars if he can actually tell him where to find some honey. He explains that if there's any nearby, his body is basically programmed to react to the smell. Mars gets a huge grin on his face. He says that once they deal with the chicken, they'll definitely go hunting for some honey. Bearson looks at the kid and asks if he'll come along on an adventure with him next time, but then his expression gets a bit more serious as he asks if Mars is planning on giving him a name too. Mars doesn't even hesitate. He just laughs and tells the big guy that of course he's getting a name, which actually brings a pretty genuine smile to Bearson's face for once. The big guy says that sounds good to him and mentions how he's really going to be looking forward to it. Moving back to the city of Barbara, Mars peeks over the wall and notices that the lunch rush is finally starting up, and everyone is gathered together, just eating and laughing like one big happy family. Mars looks over at Bearson and tells him to go on ahead and grab some food with everyone else. The big guy asks if Mars isn't planning on eating yet, but Mars just gives him a little laugh and explains that he's got something he wants to handle before he sits down for his own meal. He gets this huge, excited look on his face and calls out to Lin and Shiro because he's standing right over that giant dead bird, pumping his fist and asking the girls if they're ready to cook. Shiro looks a little caught off guard by his energy, so Lin tells her she doesn't have to push herself. But Mars is already in the zone, and Lin sighs, saying she might as well join in since she has no choice. Mars teases her though, pointing out her tail is wagging despite the attitude, while Shiro admits she's actually excited. So the group gets focused and ready to dive into the hard work together. It takes a bit, but they get through the messy part, and Mars announces they've finished butchering the whole thing. Mars looks over and tells Lin she did an amazing job with the bird, and she just blushes while thanking him, then asks what he's planning to make. Mars gets a huge smile and says he's glad she asked, because the dish is none other than fried chicken, and he says it with total confidence while Lin and Shiro just stare back at him, totally confused by the name. He tells them it isn't anything too complicated and suggests they get started. So he begins mixing soy sauce, garlic, sesame oil, mirin, and sake together, adding a bit of fruit juice as a secret ingredient before marinating the meat. As he mixes it all by hand, he wonders if this world has all the right spices, but for now, he just focuses on getting the oil poured into the pot. The pot is finally ready, so Mars sets it right over the campfire heat, but then Lin points at the leftover meat and asks what they should do with the rest. Mars realizes she's right and says he'll just take half of it for himself, telling her she's free to use the other half however she wants, which totally catches her off guard, so she asks him if he's really sure about that. He just laughs it off, saying the meat would rot anyway before he could finish it. But then he tells her not to worry about the spoilage at all because he sticks his hand out and uses a freeze spell to preserve everything instantly. Lin just makes a confused noise while Shiro thinks he's doing crazy stuff again, though Mars doesn't notice their faces, suddenly remembering something he forgot. Mars stares off into space, getting serious for a second. He realizes that if he's going to keep this up, he's gotta figure out better ways to preserve all this food. He thinks about how rare ice magic actually is around here and starts wondering if he should just teach the skill to everyone else. The idea has him groaning out loud. Shiro notices him making those weird noises and asks Lin if he's been at it for a while, but Lin just says they should probably leave him alone to figure it out. Mars finally snaps out of his head and gets back to the task at hand, moving on to the cooking. He explains that once the marinated meat is coated in flour, it's ready. He grabs a piece with his chopsticks and says it's time for the meat to go in, dropping it straight into the pot. The oil starts sizzling like crazy as Mars watches the meat fry with a big smile on his face. Watching from the side, Shiro is totally blown away by how bold the cooking style is, while Lin realizes she's never seen anyone use oil like this before. The meat finishes up perfectly, and Mars tells them that once it hits that golden brown color, it's officially good to go. He lifts a piece out but makes sure to let the extra oil drain off first, looking pretty proud of how the fried chicken turned out. Mars gets all fired up and says it's finally time to eat. He leans in and takes a huge, crunchy bite, looking like he's in heaven. Mars takes a huge bite of the fresh fried chicken and immediately starts yelling about how hot it is. But he doesn't care because the taste is exactly what he was going for. The mix of garlic and soy sauce with that deep savory flavor is just right. He closes his eyes to really enjoy the crunch, thinking to himself that the texture is honestly the best part. And Shiro is right there with him, munching away with her mouth full while she tells everyone how good it tastes. Lin is looking pretty shocked too, holding a piece and saying that the food is so good it's actually kind of addictive. Mars looks back at the girls and laughs, asking them if they saw that coming. Then he explains that this is exactly what making Karaj is all about. But as they're standing there enjoying the meal, the door pops open and Leo sticks his head in, asking what that amazing smell is. Rabbi and Bearson are right behind him, with the little rabbit girl noticing the loud sizzling sound coming from the pot. So Mars just smiles at the group and tells them they showed up at the perfect time to grab a bite. Mars looks up and sees Bearson and Leo standing in the doorway with a bunch of knights behind them. He's totally caught off guard as more townspeople crowd around asking what smells so good and if he's cooking again. He realizes there's no way out of this, So he just grits his teeth and decides to go all out, shouting to the whole group that he's going to make enough food for every single person there. Shiro gets super excited and offers to help him cook. And before long the food is ready for the hungry crowd. Rabbi, Leo and Max all start digging in, and they can't believe how good it is. One of the guys yells out about the amazing flavor while everyone laughs and eats together. Then someone points out that this stuff is the perfect snack to have with a drink. Even Bear-san is surprised by how much people love it. Nearby, a little kid yells to his mom that he couldn't eat another bite, and she just smiles back, telling him she's glad he's full while Bear-san watches the happy scene. Bear-san watches the scene closely with his sharp, scarred eyes, taking in everything that's happening between Leo and Lin as they stand together in the crowded room. Nearby, Lin and Shiro are just laughing and having a great time with everyone, and Mars stays quiet, just observing how well all the different groups are getting along. Bear-san looks out at the happy crowd and asks Mars if this is how he usually handles things, which makes Mars stop for a second. He says he guesses that's just how it is. Bear-san gets serious for a moment and admits that he actually hates the human race, but Mars isn't surprised at all. He just nods and says he figured that was the case. While Shiro keeps happily eating, Bear-san explains that he doesn't want to involve his people in his personal grudges anymore. And Mars looks over at the smiling beastman, simply saying that he understands where the big guy is coming from. Bear-san makes a big decision, saying that for the time being, he's going to swallow his pride and look past his issues with humans. He tells Mars that he's actually going to lend him his strength, explaining that he'll do whatever it takes if it means he can help out his own kin. Mars gets a big smile on his face, quietly agreeing and telling the big guy thanks, since this is exactly what he wanted. He tells Bear-san that he's really looking forward to working with him. Bear-san nods along with his eyes closed, saying that he's counting on Mars to pull his weight too. Suddenly Mars starts making these loud, weird noises like he's performing, and Bear-san just stares, totally confused. Lin just shrugs it off, explaining to the group that Lord Mars is honestly just a bit of a weirdo. Bear-san looks on, thinking to himself that there's definitely a super thin line between being a genius and being crazy. Mars hears them talking and gets pretty annoyed, yelling out to ask who exactly they think they're calling an idiot. Mars stands there with his eyes closed, thinking to himself that he can't move from this spot or take another step. He's convinced that staying exactly where he is actually his right. He gets a serious look on his face, starting to explain his reasoning because according to him, nobody on Earth can actually resist how good a futon feels. Lin just looks down at him from the side, telling him she gets it already, so she tells him he needs to quit stalling and just get out of bed. Mars starts fake crying, telling Lin she's being way too cold and reminding her she used to be cute. But he keeps going, bringing up how she used to beg him to sleep with her because she was lonely, which leaves her totally embarrassed. Lavi asks if that's actually true, and Mars just keeps gushing about how adorable Lin used to be. Lin finally loses her patience and rips the blankets right off him, leaving him completely exposed. Mars is shivering like crazy after having his blankets ripped away. He yells at Lin, asking what she's thinking since it's freezing in there. Lin's face is totally red as she screams back at him. She wants to know what's wrong with him and exactly how many years ago he's talking about. Mars tries to argue that it definitely happened, but Lin isn't having any of it. She snaps at him, telling him he needs to just forget about all that. Lavi watches the two of them bicker back and forth. She can't help but mention how close they actually seem to be, which completely catches them off guard. Mars and Lin both panic and point at Lavi, shouting "rabbit" at the top of their lungs just to change the subject. Lin tries to get things back on track by lecturing Mars. She tells him he shouldn't be the type of adult who just sleeps the morning away and skips breakfast. Mars isn't about to let her win that argument, so he fires right back. He starts telling her she shouldn't grow up to be the kind of adult who goes around ripping blankets off people while they're sleeping happily. They just stare each other down, and the vibe gets so intense and awkward that Lavi starts losing it. She lets out a shaky laugh before she just starts wailing. Her voice rings out from the building as she panics. She's just trying to figure out which one of them is actually right. Mars takes a long sip of his hot drink and lets out a satisfied sigh. It hits the spot perfectly while he tells Shiro the drink is amazing since it's warming him up from the inside out. Shiro smiles, explaining she decided to whip some up because of how cold it's been lately. Mars closes his eyes, commenting that it really feels like winter has finally arrived, the freezing weather making it so he doesn't even want to get out of bed, though Shiro just brushes off his laziness with a quick reply. Lin joins in, looking at the fire and noting there's a limit to where they can even put fireplaces. And because of that, the hallways in this massive place always stay chilly no matter what they do. Mars figures it probably wouldn't be an issue in a normal-sized house, and Lin agrees with him, saying that other homes aren't nearly as spacious as this one, which is why having just a single fireplace is usually enough to keep everything warm for regular people. The The girl mentions that the beastmen finally have their temporary housing all finished up, and because of that, they should be able to make it through the winter just fine. She also notes that they've been eating really well lately, which is a big relief since Lin adds that everyone is finally starting to get their strength back after all this time. Mars looks over and mentions those beastmen still look pretty cold in those thin outfits, but Lin explains that they actually have fur and their own aura to keep them safe, so it's honestly not as freezing as it looks to a normal person. Mars just smiles, realizing that's right. Speaking of keeping people warm, he's got a surprise coming up because he tells Lin that the secret project he've been working on is actually finished today. Lin gets excited and says she knows exactly what he means, and that everyone is going to be so happy. The beastmen gather around with confused looks, trying to figure out what's going on as they see a massive rectangular pit that Mars had them dig out of the dirt. Mars looks over at the group with a huge smile and calls out to all the strong beastmen, asking for their help, which gets the guys fired up and ready to move. The strongest beastmen in the village haul over a massive wooden frame, and then Lin looks at it totally confused, asking if it's just a giant box. But someone else realizes it's actually a bath. The word spreads quickly through the crowd that they're looking at a huge bathtub. So Mars explains he had the whole thing built using all that lumber they brought back from the forest. He tells the guys to lower the massive tub right into the hole they prepared, and once it's in place, he orders everyone to fill in the gaps while they shout back that they've got it. Mars yells out to the human workers to start building the sheds right on top of the foundation, and they all shout back that they're on it. The plan is to assemble everything right there on the spot, using the same exact method they used for the bathhouse. By putting the pieces together separately beforehand, they can get these buildings up way faster than normal. A finished log cabin stands ready, it's finally done, and everyone is stoked that the project is complete. Mars stands before the crowd with his arms wide open, thanking every single person there for working together so well. He tells them that if everyone keeps playing their part like this, their lives in this place are definitely going to get a lot better. But he makes sure to clarify he isn't asking them to be best friends or anything, even as some of the guys look a bit hesitant. Leo and the others listen as Mars just asks everyone to contribute in whatever way they can, leading to the workers talking amongst themselves, wondering what the actual plan is while still feeling a little unsure about the whole setup. One guy makes up his mind and says he'll help. If it means saving his family, he's willing to do whatever it takes. One of the workers speaks up and says that if they can just do what Mars is suggesting, everything should be fine, and Mars watches as the others start to agree, with another guy finally deciding they should just get to work. Mars gives a small smile, happy to see the mood is finally shifting, but then Bearson chimes in, reminding all the beastmen there that they come from a proud race. Leo looks a bit conflicted and admits that's true, while someone else points out that the new buildings will actually keep them warm. Bearson gets real for a second. He admits he can't stand taking orders from humans, but he definitely hates the idea of starving or freezing to death way more. He asks the group where their pride is, making Mars stop and just listen as the beastmen debate their future. So eventually Bearson just sighs and says he guesses this setup is way better than just sitting around and suffering. Mars is pretty happy about how it's going. He can tell they're finally starting to come around to his way of doing things. There's still a ton of work to do with the women's quarters and the other houses, but Mars just tells himself he's going to give it his best shot. Mars holds his hand out over a magic circle, calling out that it's time to add the water, and a massive blast of water shoots from his palm, filling up the giant wooden tub he built. He turns to the group of fire mages and tells them to start boiling it, so they all shout back ready to help. They get to work using their magic, and pretty soon the water is steaming hot. Mars looks on with a satisfied smile, seeing that everything is finally coming together just right. He tells the beastmen to go ahead and hop in, and they don't waste a single second jumping into the hot bath. One guy lets out a loud shout of relief, while another kid says he feels totally reborn. Even the girls are loving it, with one of them grinning ear to ear about how amazing the water feels. A couple of the guys look over at Mars and thank him for setting this all up, and then one of them says that after a soak like this, he's ready to give it his absolute all when they get back to work tomorrow. Mars stands by the door watching the beastmen enjoy the water, telling them he didn't really do much because this bath is something they all work to create together. The group looks happy, so Mars finally heads out of the building, walking past a couple of guys standing guard outside, but he stops when he notices someone waiting for him right there in the path. It's Lin, and she greets him by saying good work on everything he finished today. Mars says her name and realizes she actually came all the way out here to pick him up. But as they start walking, she asks why he didn't tell them he used magic during that talk just now. Mars looks a little sheepish and says he only used a tiny bit, but then he starts to explain that he doesn't think he should just solve every single problem with magic. mostly because he wants to make sure they can handle things on their own even after he's gone. Mars smiles as they walk, saying he just thinks it's important to make sure everything keeps running smoothly. Lin stays quiet for a second, just looking at him with this really impressed expression, but then she speaks up and tells him he's getting ahead of himself. Mars doesn't seem to mind, so Lin follows it up by admitting that honestly he's right about what needs to happen. She looks at him with a lot of respect, saying he's actually pretty noble for thinking about the city, but then Mars ruins the moment by joking that if they handle things, he can retire early and be lazy. Lin immediately snaps at him, yelling that he's getting way ahead of himself again. Mars just laughs it off and says that since he worked so hard today, he's ready to head back home and just relax in a hot bath for the rest of the night. As he walks away, Mars mentions he's hitting the guild tomorrow to get something done while it's still cold. Lin walks ahead of Mars, making sure he knows that he definitely can't retire just yet. They arrive at the Adventurers Guild, and right away people start noticing them showing up. The whispers start immediately. Some guy in the crowd asks if that's the new lord everyone is talking about. Another guy points out that even though Mars is royalty, he seems to favor beastmen way too much. The vibe in the room is pretty tense, with one of the adventurers asking if he's just there to steal their jobs again. Lin catches on to the dirty looks they're getting and tells Mars that these people are definitely on guard, but Mars just keeps a calm look on his face and says there's really nothing they can do about it. Suddenly, a guy in a suit with glasses walks up and asks if he's Lord Mars, introducing himself as Ace, the guild master. Ace asks what brings them by the guild today, and Mars tells him he'd like to have a quick talk in private. The guild master understands the situation and starts leading them to the back, telling them to follow him this way. Mars sits down in the private room while Ace mentions he's heard the adventurers are pretty unhappy with them. Ace immediately starts apologizing for the bad vibes, but Mars tells him there's really no need to do that. The guild master looks pretty stressed as he asks Mars what exactly he plans on doing with all those adventurers. So Mars apologizes right back, saying he probably should have led with his actual goal from the start. He looks Ace in the eye and tells him straight up that he has zero intention of taking away anyone's jobs, stating he wanted to make that clear first. Ace looks a bit relieved and asks if that's really the case, so Mars continues by saying he actually came here with a request specifically for the high-ranking adventurer. Ace listens closely and asks what kind of dissatisfaction Mars is trying to address with this request. Mars keeps it simple, explaining that there's a certain magic he wants them to learn along with some combat training, but Ace just looks worried, saying those high rankers are definitely going to be a difficult bunch to handle. Ace looks pretty stressed as he explains that these adventurers aren't exactly bad at what they do, they're just really bad at dealing with people or just too stuck in their ways, which is why he mentions that most of them are guys who couldn't make it in the capital. So they ended up out here with way too much pride for their own good. Mars listens to the explanation and realizes that's exactly why all these talented people are just sitting around rotting on the frontier. But then Ace gets real for a second and admits that honestly, he's one of those people who couldn't cut it back home either. Mars doesn't miss a beat and says that if that's the case, they can definitely find a way to make this work, asking Ace if he's willing to help him out. The guild master is completely shocked by the offer and immediately tells Mars he'll do absolutely anything he's asked to do. So Mars keeps it moving and tells Ace to get all the important people together and have them meet him at the training grounds. Ace shouts back that he understands completely and promises to go get in touch with everyone right this second. The scene shifts over to the training center where all the gear and practice dummies are set up, and a bunch of rough-looking high-rankers start showing up, murmuring to each other as they wait to see what's going on. Mars stands before the crowd and takes a deep breath to steady himself. He thanks everyone for coming and introduces himself as Mars, the Lord of the City. With a big smile, he tells the group he has a favor to ask of them today, but the adventurers aren't having it. They're confused and ask if he's really telling them to play nice with slaves. One of the guys looks totally worried, asking if this means they're being kicked out of the city altogether. So Mars ignores the panic and tells the mages they'll be starting magic training with him personally. He points to the girl beside him and says the warriors will be practicing swordsmanship with Rin, which just makes the crowd even angrier. They shout about what they're supposed to get out of this and why he's even doing it. Mars yells over the noise that he'll explain everything later, but for now, he promises a reward for anyone who can actually defeat him or Rin in a fight. The men in the crowd start whispering to each other, and one of them says that if that's how things are, the guy with the glasses smirks and says he might just have to teach that little brat a lesson. One of the other guys looks over at Rin and says they should take down the beastwoman too. He thinks to himself that if getting paid is really this easy, then it's a total steal, so the adventurer charges at Rin with his sword out, laughing and telling her to blame her master for what's about to happen. Rin doesn't even blink as she lands a clean hit, and the guy just lets out a pathetic sound. Someone from the crowd yells out to ask what he's even doing since his opponent is supposedly just a deer anchor, but Rin doesn't stop and delivers another heavy blow that sends the guy reeling in pain. The guy is completely doubled over and can't believe he's losing to someone who is only ranked so low. Rin just looks down at him and calmly points out that she's actually C rank right now. Lin stands her ground with her weapon ready, looking completely relaxed as she asks who wants to be next. Mars watches the whole thing with a huge grin, thinking about how much fun this is turning out to be. He steps forward and tells the crowd of adventurers that their next challenge is coming right up, letting them know that in the end, he plans on having every single one of these wizards taking his class. Mars can tell by the looks on their faces that they aren't exactly thrilled with that idea. So, he figures it's probably best to start with something simple that they can actually wrap their heads around. It seems like the perfect time for him to test out some of the new experiments he's been working on. So he addresses the group and tells them that for the very first step of the lesson, he wants them to just go ahead and fire whatever magic they want directly at him. The adventurers are totally caught off guard by the request, whispering to each other about what they should even do. The adventurers are clearly hesitating, and one guy with glasses asks if he's going to get arrested for treason the second he actually fires a spell. But Mars just laughs it off and promises the whole group that no matter what happens, he isn't going to punish anyone. He takes a second to look them over and gets ready to turn up the heat a bit, saying that maybe they aren't actually worried about the law and they're all just being a bunch of cowards. Mars gives them a mockingly sweet, there, and suggests that if they're struggling, they should just imagine he's someone they absolutely hate, before doubling down and telling them they're all just rotting away in the middle of nowhere, so it's natural they have no confidence. He tops it off by saying he might as well just find some talented kid and teach them from scratch instead, which really hits a nerve, causing one adventurer to shout back that he isn't stuck in this rut by choice. The guys are totally fuming now, yelling about how they don't belong in a place like this and finally agreeing to take the shot, because they're all completely fed up with being looked down on by everyone. The adventurers finally snap and unleash everything they've got, with one guy yelling for his flame lance to burn through while another shouts for his stone cannon to smash everything to pieces. Right next to them, the rest of the group joins in, screaming for their wind and water spells to rip through and blow everything away. All these elemental attacks fly straight at Mars. The magic closes in. Looking at the incoming spells, Mars admits to himself that their power and control are actually pretty impressive. He figures it's exactly what someone should expect from mid-rank adventurers, and he's satisfied with the results. He says that these guys are going to be perfect for the experiment he's planning. He puts his hand out and calls forth a move called Sand Castle, and suddenly this massive structure blocks the entire path. The adventurer's magic slams into the giant sand wall with a heavy thud, but it doesn't even leave a scratch. One guy is completely losing it, yelling out and asking what kind of crazy magic they're even looking at. The whole group is just standing there in shock, unable to believe that he just repelled their strongest attacks like it was nothing. The adventurers are losing their minds, yelling about how his defense just blocked a mid-level spell like it was nothing. Mars just stands there thinking to himself about how the people in this world don't even understand the basics of combining magic types. It's clear that his sand wall was only a simple mix of earth and water magic to boost the durability, but it's totally beyond them. He realizes that having his memories from a past life along with this insane amount of mana gives him a huge edge. Honestly, he's starting to see that he's basically a living cheat code in this world. Mars decides to push them further and taunts the whole group, asking if that's really all they can do. He tells them to keep the attacks coming and promises that he won't even move or try to fight back this time. The adventurers can't believe his confidence, while Rin yells out his name because she's terrified he's going to get hurt. Mars just shouts back for her to stay put because he's got this. He feels a bit bad for making Rin worry, but he's got a new experiment he needs to test out right now. The adventurers are absolutely freaking out, yelling and losing their cool as they prepare to throw everything they have at him one more time. Mars stands his ground and braces himself as the magic comes flying in, letting out a massive shout to pull his energy together just before the attacks slam into him, causing a huge explosion that covers everything in dust. The adventurers are losing it. One guy yells in shock while the guy with glasses screams that it was a direct hit. As the smoke hangs in the air, someone calls out, desperately asking if Mars is even alive in there. Mars just casually walks out of the cloud with a smile, telling them he's fine and asking if there's a problem. He looks himself over and realizes he doesn't have a single scratch or any pain. His clothes aren't even dirty. A smirk creeps across his face because everything went exactly like he thought it would, and it confirms his theory that if you can just wrap your whole body in your own magic, then you basically become totally resistant to any magic attacks thrown your way. Mars thinks about how beastmen are able to cover themselves in aura. It makes them way more durable in a fight, and he figured humans should be able to do the exact same thing using magic power instead. He clenches his fist, feeling pretty good because it turns out his theory was actually right on the money. While he stands there, he realizes that beastmen are mostly limited to just boosting their physical defense, but humans can use this trick for magic defense too. Suddenly, Lin screams his name and runs toward him while the guys in the back are just completely losing it. She grabs onto him immediately, asking if he's hurt anywhere or if he's feeling any kind of pain. Mars gets a bit flustered and tries to get her to calm down, telling her she just needs to listen to him. The adventurers are staring in total shock. One guy stammers that he's alive, while Ace notices he doesn't have a single scratch. Ace just stands there looking at the kid, wondering what kind of crazy magic he's even using to pull that off. Mars realizes that his theory was right, and it turns out absolutely nobody in this world knows about this magic. He thinks about how the messed up history between humans and beastmen is probably the reason why. It's crazy to him that after all this time, no one ever figured out how to share these techniques. Mars asks Lin if she can finally let go of him now, and she completely loses it, apologizing while turning bright red. He just smiles and thanks her for worrying about him so much. Meanwhile, the adventurers are still lying all over the ground, groaning about how they couldn't even touch the kid. They can't believe they got wrecked so easily even though they all ganged up on him at the same time. Lin looks over and casually mentions how she beat her own opponent to a total pulp, and Mars just gives a little smile, telling her he's glad to see her in such a good mood. She admits the guy she fought actually had some guts, since he even asked her for advice on how to get stronger. Mars decides that since they understand the situation, there isn't a problem anymore. He calls out to the group and tells them to follow him this way. Leaving the guild master and the rest of the guys just nodding along, he asks if his power is clear to them now. Mars looks them over and explains that he's not asking them to do exactly what he does, mostly because what he's doing is probably way too difficult for them to pull off. One of the guys tries to protest, but Mars cuts him off, saying they can at least get close to his level. He leans in and asks if they actually want to try training their magic for real. Mars asks if they want to get back at everyone who's ever looked down on them, and he tells them they just need to be as single-minded as they were before, which is the only way they'll ever show up those people back in the royal capital. The adventurers are starting to come around. One guy says he's in, and the others quickly follow suit. Mars watches them with a satisfied look as they finally commit to his plan, so the whole group lets out a massive shout to fire themselves up for what's coming next. The sun comes up the next day over the city, and everyone gathers early for the first session. The guys are already miserable, shivering and asking how much longer they have to wait. Mars finally speaks up and tells them he thinks they've had enough of the cold for now. He flashes a smile and tells the group he's ready to officially start their training today, but one of the guys stops him. He says the training is fine, but he needs to know who he's dealing with. The guy introduces himself as Yan, a C-rank adventurer who looks a bit worn out, and he explains that because he's the oldest and highest-ranked person in the group, he's acting as the mediator. Yan gets straight to the point and asks why they were all forced out here in thin clothes during the freezing morning, but Mars just smiles and tells them he's going to have everyone learn ice magic since it's a branch of water magic. He clarifies that for the training to work, it was actually necessary for them to be this cold. So Yan looks pretty skeptical and asks if ice magic is really something that works better when you're freezing. Mars explains that magic is mostly about visualization, so he figured the cold would make things easier to learn. Then he tosses out a random question, asking Yan if he knows what water is actually made of. Mars puts his hands together and wonders if his idea will actually work, while a glow starts to appear. He focuses on the image of water, and small orbs start floating up between his palms as he works. A large, clear blob of water forms right in the center of his hands while he keeps his focus steady. Yan sounds confused, asking if water is just made of more water, and Mars says that's exactly it while showing how it separates. Mars keeps explaining things, telling the group that water is actually made of a bunch of separate parts. And when things start getting cold, those little parts have a specific property where they start sticking together and hardening. He thinks to himself that explaining actual molecules would be way too much. So one of the guys asks if it's like how humans huddle together when it's freezing, and Mars tells him that's a great way to put it. He tells the adventurers to try using their magic while keeping that specific image in mind, leading Shiro to step up with her sword. Looking a bit nervous but ready to start her own training, Mars looks over and sees them getting to work. But then he turns his attention to how Lin is doing. Suddenly Shiro starts losing it and yells no while she tries to back away from the training, but Lin is already behind her, telling her she's too slow as she gets the jump on her. Lin tells Shiro her stance is weak and she'll never cut anything like that. but the poor girl is just worried about someone getting hurt. Lin keeps teasing Shiro, asking if she actually thinks she can land a hit and telling her to give it a shot, while Shiro just stands there with her cheeks puffed out. The girl swings her sword with a loud yell, but Lin doesn't even move, which makes Mars think about how much this reminds him of the old days. He remembers how Lin used to train with his brother Lyle back then, and honestly, the whole group used to practice exactly like this. Mars starts wondering how Lyle is even doing now, picturing him probably barging into the palace and yelling at their brother Royce for exiling him. The training wraps up and the adventurers are looking pretty beat, with one guy apologizing for being slow while Yan admits he's totally out of mana. Mars tells them it's no big deal because he saw them working hard, but Yan is still worried they won't finish their daily tasks. He tells them not to stress about the work and promises everyone is going to get paid for their time regardless. And then, he points toward a small wooden building nearby and asks the whole group if they can follow him over there for a minute. The guys are completely confused and one asks where they even are, but Mars just opens the door and tells them to go right in. He just keeps smiling and encourages the tired group to quit overthinking it and just step inside. The adventurers lose it when they see the steaming bath waiting for them. Everyone starts yelling in total shock, realizing Mars is serious about this. He tells them they can go right in and mentions he's already got a big meal ready, but then he drops the real motivator. He tells the group there's a cash bonus for the first person who learns the skill, leaving Yan looking completely stunned. The guys start tripping over themselves to thank him, swearing they're going to give it everything they've got while everyone else joins in, determined to win that bonus. Mars just stands there with a quiet smile, watching them get fired up until the sun comes up the next day. Yan suddenly starts yelling that he actually did it. He's holding a glowing crystal, and the guy right next to him starts cheering because he managed to pull it off too. The whole group is pumped now, shouting about how they're ready to get to work while Mars just laughs to himself. He realizes the hot bath and the food were great, but that extra bonus was definitely the clincher, making him realize that using the carrot and the stick is basically the best way to get results from anyone.